Welcome to the Extraordinary 10 podcast. What if the third of your life you think is just a biological pause is actually the most active, dangerous, and computationally intense time of your entire existence? What if, while you lie there, paralyzed, your brain is running these high-stakes evolutionary simulations, scrubbing away neurotoxins and actively rewriting the very architecture of your personality?
We do. We tend to view sleep as a deficit, don't we? It's like a tax we pay to the body. But the neurological reality, it suggests it's a separate state of consciousness entirely, a hidden dimension where the brain is, well, arguably more awake in its processing power than when your eyes are actually open.
We are here to challenge that passive view of the sleepy mind. We've curated 10 specific empirical facts from neuroscience and psychology that reframe sleep not as rest, but as work. And just to give you a sense of the biological stakes here, consider fact number 8, which we'll get to shortly. We're going to discuss the glymphatic system. I mean, actual evidence that your brain cells physically shrink by up to 60% during non-REM sleep just to flush out beta amyloid toxins. It's not rest, it's a physical self-cleaning cycle to stave off neurodegeneration.
And the implications for survival are just as critical. When we get to fact number 3, the fear trainer, we'll debate the evolutionary function of nightmares. The data suggests these aren't just system errors. No, they're deliberately engineered threat simulations designed to prime your motor cortex for survival in the waking world.
And ultimately, at the very top of the list, fact number 1, the infinite library. The evidence that suggests memory consolidation during sleep involves an active editing process, where the hippocampus literally decides which parts of your personality to keep and which parts to delete.
By the end of this session, I promise you will never look at sleep or your dreams the same way again.
Our discussion today is all centered on the Extraordinary 10 framework. We are going to map the unconscious mind, ranging from the external influence of media on dream texture, that's fact 10, down through the physiological paralysis of fact 6, all the way to the cognitive editing of the self at number 1.
It's a roadmap, really, moving from the sociological surface deep into the biological hardwiring.
All right, are you ready to see the world differently? Let's start the clock. We're officially starting the clock. You might think you know the basics of this subject, but the reality is so much bigger than you imagine. Let's start with the true scale, fact number 10.
Okay, so we're beginning with what's technically known as the media input hypothesis, or maybe more colloquially, the TV effect. I want to start here because it immediately challenges the idea that dreams are purely internal constructs. The research, it suggests that the technology we consume doesn't just entertain us, it physically alters the encoding format of our dreams.
And this centers on that mid-20th century anomaly, right? The Schwitzgebel studies and others that noted this huge shift in dream reports.
Precisely. If you look at the historical data, specifically dream reports from the early 1900s, human beings, they reported dreaming in color. The descriptions had all these chromatic details, blue skies, red flowers. However, starting in the 1940s and then extending all the way through the 1950s, there was a statistically significant shift. A massive cohort of the population began reporting dreams exclusively in grayscale.
Okay, I want to pause there immediately, because this is where the debate usually lies. Are we suggesting the brain actually stopped generating color? Or is this just a reporting bias? Because, humans see in color. The world is in color. It seems biologically counterintuitive that a few hours of television would override millions of years of evolutionary biology.
That is the skeptical position, and look, it's a valid one. The argument for reporting bias suggests that because the dominant media narrative, TV, newspapers, was all black and white, people they described their dreams using that vocabulary. They were reconstructing the memory through a grayscale filter, not actually experiencing it that way.
Right. If I ask you to describe a scene from 1955, you might just default to the visual language of the time.
However, the data makes that very difficult to fully accept. The correlation is incredibly precise. The shift to grayscale reports tracks almost perfectly with the adoption curves of monochrome television in Western households. And crucially, when color television became dominant in the late 60s and 70s, well, the color returned to the dream reports. If it were just a linguistic quirk, you wouldn't expect such a tight coupling with the actual hardware in people's living rooms.
So you're arguing for the input hypothesis, that the visual cortex is, in effect, training its pattern recognition software on the dataset it receives most frequently?
Exactly. Think about neuroplasticity. The brain is an efficiency engine. It predicts reality based on the data it's fed. In the mid-50s, for a child, the most emotionally salient, high-contrast, narrative-rich data was coming from a glowing cathode ray tube.
Salience is the key word there.
It is, because you could argue, well, the kid is only watching TV for 3 hours, the rest of the day is in full color. But the TV is where the stories are. It's where the emotional engagement happens.
I see the logic there. The brain prioritizes data that carries emotional weight. So if the important things are happening in black and white on I Love Lucy or The Twilight Zone, the brain might encode narrative simulation, which is basically what a dream is, in that same format.
Precisely. The visual cortex isn't just a camera recording the world. It's learning a specific font for storytelling. And for that generation, the default font for subconscious simulation became grayscale. It's not that they couldn't dream in color, it's just that the brain chose the format it associated with storytelling.
It's interesting you mentioned the font, because if we accept that the brain is this malleable, that it will adopt the visual constraints of our media, then the implications for today are far, far more complex than just color versus black and white.
That is where the research moves from, a historical curiosity to an active concern. We aren't watching I Love Lucy anymore. We are engaging with high-fidelity, interactive, three-dimensional virtual environments.
So let's talk about the mechanism of action here. In the 1950s, the input was passive. You sat still, you watched a box. Today, with VR and high-intensity gaming, the input is active. We have the iPad generation and now the Oculus generation. If that Schwitzgebel study holds true, we shouldn't just be seeing a change in color, we should be seeing a change in physics.
And we are. This is exactly where Jane Gackenbach's research comes into play. She studied the dreams of high-frequency gamers, people spending hours every day in first-person environments. And her data suggests that these individuals don't just dream about games. The actual structural architecture of their dreams changes.
Changes how?
In a game, if a monster attacks you, you don't just run, you fight back. You have agency. Gackenbach found that gamers transfer this very agency into their nightmares. They turn around and they fight the demon because their brain has been trained that threat equals combat scenario, not just flight response.
See, I look at that data and I see two sides of a coin. On one hand, that sounds like an adaptive advantage, a superpower even. But on the other, isn't there a risk of dissociation? If the brain begins to treat all high-stress scenarios as a game with a user interface, are we losing the biological grounding of fear?
That is the debate. Is it dissociation or is it evolution? You call it dissociation, I might call it cognitive insulation. If the world is becoming more and more digital, well, the brain is adapting to survive in a digital conceptual space.
But let's look at the edge cases. There are reports of gamers dreaming with user interface overlays, heads-up displays, HUDs appearing in their sleep, health bars, mini-maps.
Correct. The brain has integrated the UI into its very definition of sight.
That suggests the visual cortex is interpreting the interface as part of reality. My concern is, what happens when that bleeds into the waking world? Or more specifically, what happens to the development of a child whose primary reality testing is happening in a world where gravity is optional and death is just a respawn timer?
That is the variable reality problem. If a child spends their most formative neuroplastic years, say ages 5 to 12, in VR, where they can fly or teleport or manipulate matter, the brain encodes those possibilities as valid movement patterns.
Exactly. In the 50s, the damage, if we can even call it that, was just aesthetic. The dreams were gray, but the physics were still real. Lucy Ricardo still walked on the floor. In VR, the physics themselves are fluid. So if the brain encodes that as the narrative font, are we raising a generation whose subconscious simulations are fundamentally untethered from physical reality?
It's possible. We might see a generation with a higher capacity for abstract problem solving because they aren't bound by Newtonian physics in their internal simulations. Or, to your point, we might see a generation with a fragmented sense of embodiment. We don't know yet.
It really brings us back to the input hypothesis. The brain is an optimization machine. It doesn't care about truth with a capital T. It cares about utility. In 1955, the utility was pay attention to the glowing box. In 2026, the utility is navigate the virtual space.
I think truth versus utility is the perfect way of framing it. The TV effect proves that the brain is willing to sacrifice fidelity for familiarity. It didn't matter that the real world was colorful. The brain preferred the familiar mediated pattern of the screen.
Which suggests that human consciousness is not some fixed constant. It's a mirror reflecting the tools we use. We shape our tools and then our tools shape our dreams, literally.
And consider the speed of this shift. It took millions of years for the eye to evolve to see color. It took less than 20 years of television to convince the sleeping brain to turn that color off. That's how sensitive the system is.
It highlights a fragility we often ignore. We think of our dreams as this sacred, untouched inner sanctum, a private theater. But Fact 10 shows that the theater is sponsored. The scenery is being painted by the technology we consume.
We are the clay, and the media environment is the sculptor.
And right now, that sculptor is using much more aggressive tools than a black and white broadcast. We are in the middle of a massive neurological experiment with VR and AR, and we won't know the results until this generation starts reporting their dreams in, say, 10 years.
It forces us to ask, what constitutes natural sleep anymore? If every hour of waking input is mediated by a screen, natural sleep might just be a relic of the past.
A relic, or perhaps something we have to actively fight to reclaim. This is why the study of dream content is so vital. It's the canary in the coal mine for what technology is doing to our cognition.
Absolutely. If you want to know how a society thinks, don't look at their art, look at their nightmares. Look at the texture of their REM cycles.
That foundation is mind-blowing, but it only scratches the surface. To really understand the scale of what we're dealing with, we have to look at fact number 9, which takes this concept into a completely different dimension. Welcome back. We are moving deeper into our countdown. Let's dive into fact number 9.
The 90% eraser.
This is, well, it's perhaps one of the most universally frustrating experiences known to the human condition. I mean, it cuts across cultures, across ages, demographics. We're talking about that specific, agonizing moment of waking up. You've just experienced something profound, maybe a flying castle, a conversation with a lost loved one, or, a solution to a problem that has plagued you for weeks. It feels vivid, it feels real.
And then the theft happens.
Exactly. It's not just a fade, it's an active dissolution. We're looking at the neuroscience of why nearly 90% of dream content just vanishes within 10 minutes of waking. And while a lot of people see this as a failure of memory, a glitch in the system, I want to argue today that this is actually a sophisticated and intentional biological feature. It's a necessary neurological cleanup.
I see why you'd frame it as a feature, especially regarding efficiency. But I have to push back on the necessary part right away. I look at this statistic, 90% deletion, and I don't see a cleanup crew. I see a massive loss of data. I mean, we're talking about a unique cognitive state where the brain is hyper-associative and creative, and yet the system is designed to hit the delete button the moment we regain consciousness. I think there's a tragedy in that mechanism that we need to explore.
That is a compelling emotional frame, and I certainly feel that loss myself. But let's look at the hard data of the experience first. The source material breaks this down into a terrifyingly precise timeline. It describes the first 3 seconds of waking. In that window, you have it all. You remember the impossible geometry, the sensory details, but then comes the 8-second window. You reach for your phone to write it down.
And in those 8 seconds, the towers of that castle crumble into fog. That's the phrasing from the material that really stuck with me. By the 90-second mark, you aren't even holding the narrative anymore. You're holding a fragment. Maybe the color purple or a feeling of urgency, but the structure is just gone.
Precisely. And my argument is that this rapid decay is protective. Let's look at the how for a moment. This isn't magic, it's chemistry. During sleep, the brain has a very specific hormonal balance. But upon waking, we see this massive spike in cortisol and a drop in acetylcholine. This chemical shift signals the hippocampus, the memory center, to change modes.
But that shift is exactly what I find so puzzling. During sleep, the hippocampus relaxes its filtering rules. It allows for these random, surreal mixes of memory and emotion. It's a state of unbound creativity. So why would evolution spend 8 hours a night generating this rich, complex internal theater, only to chemically scorch the earth the moment the sun comes up?
Because of the classroom whiteboard analogy. This is really the central argument for the necessity of deletion. So imagine the brain is a whiteboard in a busy classroom. During the night, your neurons are the students. They're just scribbling wild, unfiltered ideas all over the board. Mathematical equations that don't add up, conversations between historical figures, landscapes that defy physics.
A chaotic masterpiece, sure. It's the brain off the leash.
But a chaotic masterpiece is useless for survival in the waking world. If the teacher comes in the next morning, that's your waking consciousness, and the board is still covered with that nonsense, there's no room for today's lesson. You can't learn where the predator is hiding or how to navigate your commute if your working memory is clogged with the hallucination that you can breathe underwater. The board must be erased. It isn't cruelty, it's functional necessity.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it's a binary choice between survival and remembering a dream. That implies that retaining dream memory would somehow override our ability to function in reality. But look at the exceptions. We have the surviving 10%. We have lucid dreamers. We have artists who train themselves to remember. They don't lose the ability to park their car just because they remember a dream about flying.
But they do expend significant cognitive resources to do so. The default state of the brain is efficiency. The hippocampus acts like a meticulous librarian. It has to make a ruthless choice every single morning. It can either preserve the fictional narrative or it can make space for the factual data of the coming day. You mentioned the car. That is exactly the trade-off. The librarian wipes the underwater breathing tape to ensure there's bandwidth to encode "I parked on level 4."
I think you're underestimating the capacity of the library. But let's look at the MRI evidence, because I know you value the empirical side.
Well, the MRI studies are quite damning for your position. They show that neural activity patterns associated with dream recall fade exponentially after waking, unless you deliberately rehearse that memory, essentially forcing the librarian to stop and file it immediately. The neural trace just evaporates. The brain is physically dumping the cache.
Dumping the cache makes it sound like garbage collection. But let's pivot to what is actually being thrown away. This is where I struggle with the hygiene argument. We know that the brain solves problems while we sleep. We know that the unconstrained associations in dreams can lead to breakthroughs. So we're in this paradoxical situation where the brain works all night to solve a complex emotional or creative problem.
And then destroys the evidence.
Exactly. It creates the solution and then shreds the paper it was written on. That is the unsettling philosophical question raised by the material. What if that 90% we forget contains solutions to problems we haven't solved yet? What if you had a business insight or a resolution to a relationship conflict, and it was right there, fully formed at 4 a.m., but because of this cortisol spike and this whiteboard cleaning, you woke up with nothing but a vague sense of loss?
That is a romantic notion, but I would frame it differently. I'd argue that the process of dreaming is where the value lies, not the memory of it. The brain might be running simulations, emotional processing, threat rehearsal, and the benefit is in the neural exercise itself, not in the conscious review of the tape. You don't need to remember every rep of a workout to get stronger muscles. You just need to do the work. The erasure suggests the content itself isn't the point.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the surviving 10%? The material points out that the fragments that do survive often become creative fuel for our greatest inventors and artists. If the content wasn't relevant, if it was just reps in the gym, why do we cherish that 10% so much? Why does the brain let some through?
Because the system isn't perfect, Core. Or perhaps because those memories have such a high emotional charge that they bypass the filter. But notice that to keep more than that, you have to fight your own biology. You have to keep a dream journal. You have to train.
And that training works. That's my point. The material mentions that lucid dreamers display stronger alpha wave coherence in the prefrontal cortex. They can resist the erasure. This proves that the whiteboard doesn't have to be wiped for the person to function. We have the hardware to keep these memories. We just have a default software setting that deletes them. And I think that default setting might be outdated.
Outdated? How so?
Well, in a survival context on the savannah, perhaps confusion between a dream lion and a real lion is fatal. You need a clear board. But in a modern context where our challenges are often abstract, creative, or emotional, that data we are deleting might be more valuable than the empty space we are creating. We're sacrificing the impossible narratives of sleep to inhabit the possible narratives of waking life, as the text says. But maybe we need a little more of the impossible.
I see that perspective. You view the erasure as loss of potential genius, a burning of the Library of Alexandria, every morning.
In a way, yes. It feels like a massive inefficiency in a biological system that is usually ruthless about resource management. Why generate the content if you aren't going to archive it?
Because the archiving is expensive, energy-wise, attention-wise. The meticulous librarian analogy really resonates with me because it highlights the cost of memory. If we remembered every dream with the clarity of waking life, our autobiographical memory would be chaos. We'd have memories of flying, of dying, of living entirely different lives. The distinction between reality and fabrication would blur. That's a high price to pay for a potential creative insight.
But are we sure that distinction would blur, or is that just an assumption we make to justify the erasure?
Well, the material discusses the mental hygiene aspect. It stops us from being haunted by fictitious experiences. Imagine if you carried the grief of a dream death or the terror of a dream chase with the same weight as a real trauma. The eraser protects our emotional baseline.
That is true. It is protective. But it's also limiting. The text calls it the ultimate trade-off. We sacrifice the impossible to inhabit the possible. But I worry about what we're losing in that trade. We are tidying up the stage, sure, but what if the play that was performed in the dark was better than the one we're performing in the light?
But the audience, the conscious self, wasn't there to see it. Or rather, they were there, but they were told to forget the show so they could focus on their job.
And that brings me back to the neurochemistry. Acetylcholine drops. The hippocampus stops playing jazz and starts playing classical. It prioritizes waking experience. But the fact that we can hack this with journals with intention suggests that the barrier isn't a wall, it's a curtain. And we're just too lazy or too busy to pull it back.
I wouldn't call it laziness, it's biological programming. The MRI evidence of exponential fading suggests this is a hardwired feature. It takes significant energy to fight entropy.
But look at what happens when we do. The material mentions that training recall can rewire memory circuits. We can actually upgrade the hardware, or at least the software, to handle more of this data. We don't have to accept the 90% deletion rate.
That is true. We can intervene. But should we? That is the core of the disagreement. I argue that the brain knows what it's doing. The 90% erasure is there to ensure that when you wake up, you are fully here. You aren't half stuck in a world where geometry doesn't apply. You are ready for the threats and tasks of reality.
And I argue that reality is overrated if it requires us to lobotomize our nightly creativity. We are solving problems in our sleep and then waking up amnesiacs? It is a tragic waste of processing power.
It is a fascinating tension. The efficient survival machine versus the creative explorer.
The librarian versus the artist.
Precisely. And perhaps the balance is exactly where it needs to be. We keep the 10% that really matters, the most emotional, the most vivid, and we let the rest go to clear the whiteboard.
I suppose I just mourn the scribbles on that whiteboard. I want to know what the equations were before the eraser hit.
A fair desire. But as we wrap up this analysis of fact number 9, we have to acknowledge that this mechanism, whether you view it as a cleaner or a thief, is fundamental to the human experience. We all wake up,
We all reach for the memory, and we all watch it dissolve.
Yeah, it's the universal human condition. Waking up is an act of forgetting.
Well put. And as we continue our descent through this list, we're seeing that the brain's nighttime activities are far more active and perhaps more treacherous than we assume.
Absolutely. We're just scratching the surface of what happens when the lights go out.
If you thought that was an outlier, wait until you hear this next one. Fact number 8 is where things get truly interesting, Hun.
Welcome back. We are moving deeper into our countdown. Let's dive into fact number 8.
I thought the last one was wild, but this next fact, it really changed my entire perspective.
It really does. It forces a complete reevaluation of what is happening when we close our eyes. Usually when we talk about sleep, we use these very soft, gentle metaphors. We talk about recharging the batteries or, resting the weary head. It implies that sleep is just a pause button, a lack of activity.
Right, the old model was that the brain just shuts down to save energy, like putting your laptop into sleep mode. The screen goes black, the fans spin down, and it just sits there, passively waiting for you to hit the space bar in the morning.
Exactly. But fact number 8 just throws that laptop metaphor right out the window. It reveals that while you're unconscious, your brain isn't resting. Not at all. It's actually ramping up an industrial-scale cleaning operation. We're talking about the nighttime detox.
And we aren't just using cleaning as a cute little metaphor here. We are talking about plumbing. We are talking about the discovery of the glymphatic system. It's baffling to me that in thousands of years of human medicine, this system was only discovered in the last decade or so. It fundamentally alters our understanding of why we sleep, linking it directly to the prevention of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
It's revolutionary, and that is why I'm firmly planting my flag on this side of the argument. This biological purification, this physical washing of the brain tissue, is the primary, non-negotiable function of sleep. We like to romanticize sleep as this time for dreams and emotional processing, but the biology tells a colder, harder truth. We sleep so that we don't poison ourselves. Everything else, the dreaming, the memory sorting, it's secondary to the survival need of not suffocating your own neural pathways in toxic waste.
Well, hold on, I have to pull back on the reins there. Secondary, you're taking the most complex state of human consciousness, where we consolidate memories, process trauma, simulate future realities, and you're reducing it to a janitorial shift?
I'm looking at the hierarchy of needs.
Look, I agree that the discovery of the glymphatic system is monumental. It's a game changer, absolutely. But to say it's the primary function, or to view sleep merely as a waste management system, that risks oversimplifying the incredibly complex cognitive work that is happening at the same time. We're not just washing the floors, we're renovating the entire house. If you strip away the software updates, the dreaming, the learning, you might have a clean brain, but you don't have a functioning human.
But if the house is full of toxic waste, the renovation doesn't matter. You can't hang new curtains if the drywall's radioactive. Let's look at the evidence provided in our source material, specifically the Sleep and Dreams video content. It paints a picture that is, honestly, terrifying if you don't get your 8 hours. It posits that the accumulation of metabolic waste is, and I quote, the cost of consciousness.
The cost of consciousness. That is a heavy phrase.
It is, but it's accurate. Being awake, thinking, moving, existing, it creates cellular trash. It creates metabolic ash. And sleep is the only way to pay the bill. The brain has to physically wash itself to survive. If you don't pay that bill, the system crashes, period.
I don't deny the bill has to be paid, but I want to explore what else we're buying with that time. We know from the research on REM and NREM cycles that while this cleaning is happening, the brain is also engaging in high-level data processing. I mean, if detox were the only goal, why would we see the complex architecture of dreams or the specific electrical patterns of REM? It feels like you're describing a maintenance crew, whereas I see a whole symphony of activity. The detox is the maintenance crew, sure, but it is not the whole show.
I think we need to get into the mechanics of this to really understand why I place so much weight on it. Because when you actually look at how this cleaning happens, it's so violent, biologically speaking, that it makes the dreaming argument seem almost quaint. The vivid imagery in our source material regarding Fact 8 is startling. It asks us to imagine shrinking down inside the brain at, say, 2:47 a.m. during deep sleep.
And this is where the visualization really helps, because it honestly sounds like science fiction.
It does. The source material uses this analogy of a dance floor, and I think we need to really paint that picture to understand the magnitude of this. Imagine a packed nightclub. It's Saturday night, it's shoulder to shoulder, you can't move.
Okay, I'm there. It's loud, it's hot, everyone is bumping into each other.
Right. That is your brain while you are awake. The dancers are your neurons and glial cells. They are packed tight, passing signals, firing constantly, consuming energy. The place is alive. But because it's so packed, there is no room to move.
And naturally, a party that intense creates a mess. Spilled drinks, trash on the floor. That's the metabolic waste we were talking about.
Exactly. Now, imagine trying to clean the floor of that nightclub while the party is still raging. You can't. You can't get a mop in there, you can't run a vacuum, you'd be tripping over people. The density is just too high.
So what does the brain do?
This is the Fact 8 reveal. At 2:00 a.m., deep sleep hits. The music stops. And suddenly, every single dancer takes one giant step back. They physically shrink away from their neighbors. The source material explains that these neurons pull away from each other. They physically shrink to create space.
And we are talking a millimeter here or there. The text says the space between these neurons expands by 60%. That is a massive physiological change. I mean, just imagine if your liver or your heart just decided to open up by 60% every night. It's a radical structural change for an organ enclosed in a rigid skull.
60%. It's enormous. And once that space opens up, once the dance floor clears, the doors swing open and the fire hoses come out. Cerebrospinal fluid rushes through these widened channels. It is literally a power wash. It flushes through the brain tissue deeper and faster than is ever possible during the day, sweeping away the debris that accumulated while you were awake.
It's a hydraulic system. That's what's so fascinating. It's not just a chemical process. It's a mechanical fluid dynamics process.
Say it's the primary function. The brain literally deforms itself to make this happen.
And that offline part is key, and it's where I think we find the nuance. This hydraulic washing, this rushing of cerebral spinal fluid, it happens primarily during N3 or deep slow wave sleep. It's distinct from REM sleep.
Which supports my point that this is the priority. The body prioritizes this deep sleep early in the night. It rushes to get the cleaning done first.
Or it suggests a shift work approach to brain maintenance. The brain enters deep sleep to clean the hardware, the cells, and the space between them. But then it cycles into REM to clean the software, the memories and emotions. You can't have one without the other. If you only had the power wash but never the software update, you might have a clean brain but a dysfunctional mind. You'd be a healthy organism that couldn't remember how to tie its shoes.
But let's look at what is being washed away. We aren't just talking about generic dust bunnies or spilled drinks, to keep with the nightclub analogy. We're talking about metabolic waste and toxic proteins. The source material is very specific here. It identifies tau and beta amyloid.
The Alzheimer's markers.
Precisely. These are not just innocent byproducts. These are the compounds explicitly linked to Alzheimer's disease. Beta amyloid clumps together to form plaques. Tau forms tangles. These are the physical manifestations of neurodegeneration, and this nighttime detox is the system designed to remove them. When you're awake, your neurons are firing, metabolizing energy, and producing these proteins as a byproduct.
And that brings us back to that phrase, the toxic burden of consciousness. It's such a bleak way to view life, isn't it? The idea that the very act of being human, of thinking, feeling, perceiving, loving, is biologically toxic?
It is bleak, but it's the reality check we need. Being awake damages you. Sleep repairs you. Without this methodical detoxification, the brain slowly succumbs to that burden. If you don't sleep, those proteins don't leave. They stay there, they accumulate. It's like never taking out the trash in your kitchen. Eventually, the kitchen becomes unusable. And we see this in the data. People with chronic sleep deprivation have higher levels of beta amyloid. It's a direct correlation.
I see the urgency in your argument,
And the link to Alzheimer's is incredibly compelling. It certainly raises the stakes of a good night's sleep from a luxury to a medical necessity. However, I want to challenge the causality a little bit here. We see the buildup of these proteins in sleep-deprived brains, and we see them in Alzheimer's patients. But is the buildup the cause of the sleepiness, or is it the result of wakefulness?
I think the source material suggests it's the result of wakefulness. The waste is the byproduct of neural activity.
Right, but consider the cost of this cleanup. You mentioned the dance floor clearing out. For that to happen, the brain has to totally disengage from the environment. You become unconscious, you're paralyzed. You're vulnerable to predators, to fire, to danger. Evolutionarily, that is a massive risk.
It's a huge risk.
So if the only goal was removing waste, couldn't evolution have designed a way to do it while we were awake? We have a lymphatic system in the rest of our body that works while we move. The fact that the brain requires such a total shutdown suggests that the process is incredibly biologically expensive. It requires resources that just can't be shared with being awake.
I think you're making my point for me. The fact that evolution kept this vulnerability, this state where we are unconscious for a third of our lives, proves how critical the detox is. If we didn't need it, natural selection would have eliminated sleep millions of years ago. We sleep because the alternative is toxic buildup and death. The cost of being vulnerable is outweighed by the cost of not cleaning the brain.
Or the cost is justified because we're getting a 2-for-1 deal. We get the cleaning and we get the memory consolidation, the emotional regulation, the problem-solving simulations of dreams. I'm just saying, if I'm gonna pay the price of being unconscious for 8 hours, if I'm gonna risk being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, I want more than just a car wash. I want a tune-up too.
You might want a tune-up, but the car wash is what keeps the engine from seizing. Let's look at the synthesis of this idea, the reality check delivered in the source. It says, sleep is the non-refundable price your brain charges for thinking.
It's a great line. Non-refundable.
It is. And it implies a strict transactional relationship. There is no middle ground, there is no weekend catch-up, you cannot go 5 days accumulating beta amyloid and then hope to flush it all out on Saturday morning. The biology doesn't work that way. The system requires consistency. The brain creates the waste today, it needs to wash it out tonight.
I accept the biological price. I really do. The evidence regarding the glymphatic system is irrefutable, but I want to add the psychological layer to that price. The price we pay buys us a functional mind, not just a clean brain. The source material references a distinction between dream decay, which is cleaning up data, and glymphatic clearance, which is cleaning up proteins. And this is where our two arguments actually meet.
Break that down for us. How do they meet?
So, dream decay is described as that phenomenon where 90% of our dreams vanish within 10 minutes of waking. The source calls it an intentional neurological cleanup. That's the brain clearing the cache, deleting the temporary files so you don't wake up confused about whether you actually flew a dragon to work. That is software maintenance. It keeps the operating system fast.
Right, it's deleting the spam folder.
Exactly, but the glymphatic clearance, that's hardware maintenance. That is keeping the actual silicon chips from overheating and melting. My point is, you need both. You need the hardware to be free of toxic proteins so the neurons can fire, but you also need the software, the memories and thoughts, to be organized and pruned so that the firing makes sense. You're focused on the hardware. You're focused on the vessel. I'm focused on the content of the vessel.
Because without the vessel, the content doesn't exist. If your neurons are choked with tau tangles, it doesn't matter how well organized your memories are. You won't be able to access them. That is why Fact 8 is so pivotal in this countdown. It shifts the conversation from psychology to survival. We used to think sleep was about resting the muscles or maybe just dreaming. Now we know it is a biological reset button that prevents physical degradation. A pristine computer with no operating system might be a doorstop, sure, but a computer with a perfect operating system and a melted motherboard is just a piece of burnt plastic.
That is a fair assessment. The structural integrity comes first. And the imagery of the fluid rushing through the brain, it really does highlight how active this state is. I think that's the common ground here. We both agree that sleep is not passive.
Absolutely. That is the myth that Fact 8 just destroys. Rest is a misnomer. Your body might be still, but your brain is running a marathon. It's shrinking cells, pumping fluid, flushing waste. It's an industrial operation.
And it's an operation that requires specific conditions. We touched on this, but the fact that the neurons shrink and the channels expand, that mechanical action is tied to the brain waves of deep sleep. This is why quality of sleep matters as much as quantity. If you're drinking alcohol before bed or if you have sleep apnea, you might be unconscious, but are you getting that 60% expansion? Are you getting the full wash cycle?
That is a crucial point. If you don't hit that deep N3 stage, the dancers never leave the floor. The cleaning crew can't get in, and the waste stays there.
And that accumulates over decades. It brings us back to that toxic burden. It changes how I look at aging. It changes how I look at my own sleep habits. It's not just about feeling fresh tomorrow. It's about protecting who I am 30 years from now. It really forces you to respect the pillow, doesn't it? It's not checking out, it's checking in for repairs.
Exactly. It transforms sleep from a loss of time into a preservation of self. That is the core of Fact 8. We often resent sleep because it feels like time stolen from our lives. We could be working or watching a movie or spending time with friends. But Fact 8 tells us that sleep is the only thing ensuring we have a life to live. It is the ultimate biological reset button. Without it, the machinery fails.
I can get on board with that. It is the foundation. While I will always argue that the nighttime detox is just the basement level of the skyscraper that is human consciousness, with all the dreaming and emotion living on the upper floors, you cannot have the skyscraper without the basement. It's a fascinating mechanical discovery that underpins the higher order functions that define our humanity.
And I think that synthesis is where we land. We can argue about whether the cleaning or the dreaming is more important for the soul, but biologically, the cleaning is non-negotiable. The discovery of the glymphatic system changes the definition of a good night's sleep from a luxury to a medical necessity.
It certainly makes me want to go to bed early tonight. The idea of that hydraulic wash, it's strangely comforting.
It is. It's the body taking care of itself in the most fundamental way.
It's amazing that we went so long without knowing this existed.
It is the beauty of modern neuroscience. We are finally looking under the hood.
And finding an industrial cleaning crew we didn't know we had hired.
Precisely. Now, let's take a second to process that. If that's possible, then the next revelation shouldn't surprise us, and yet it's one of the most debated mysteries in science. Shifting gears to fact number 7.
Welcome back to The Debate. We are moving deeper into our countdown. Let's dive into fact number 7.
Right, and this is the one that it typically stops people in their tracks. It's not supernatural, not at all, but it is so deeply, almost aggressively natural that it's almost uncomfortable to admit. We are talking about universal symbols.
It really is. It's a concept that challenges our entire idea of individual identity. The premise is pretty stark. Despite all the vast cultural, linguistic, and geographical differences separating us, when we close our eyes and go into REM sleep, we're often dreaming about the exact same things. It points to a shared narrative architecture that just, defies our waking borders.
See, I come at it from a different angle. You call it a narrative architecture, which sounds very grand, very artistic. I see it more as a biological redundancy. It's just hard-coded legacy software. But to really understand why I see it that way, we have to look at the evidence. The source material lays out what it calls the impossible experiment.
I love this framing. Let's construct that scenario for our listeners because the visualization is so important here. Imagine we have 5 completely distinct individuals scattered across the globe, living lives that could not be more contradictory.
Right. Subject 1, a Wall Street banker in a penthouse in Manhattan. His life is defined by, high-frequency trading algorithms, air conditioning, designer suits, and the constant hum of the city. He has likely never hunted for his own food in his entire life.
Okay, and then subject 2. A Hadza hunter-gatherer in Tanzania. He lives off the land, in the savannah. His days are defined by silence, tracking game, the heat of the sun, and this absolute reliance on his immediate tribe for survival.
And then you have subject 3, a Buddhist monk in a remote monastery in rural Tibet, surrounded by incense and silence.
dedicated to detaching from the ego. And subject 4, a teenager in suburban Tokyo, just immersed in neon, pop culture, and the intense social pressure of the Japanese school system.
And finally, subject 5, an Inuit fisher navigating the ice in northern Canada. Their entire visual horizon is white snow, black water, and gray sky. I mean, these 5 people have never met, they share no common language, they practice different religions, live under completely incompatible social systems, and their daily visual inputs, from skyscrapers to vast tundras, could not be more different.
If you put them in a room together, they couldn't communicate a single complex idea. Their conscious minds are just, their worlds apart.
And yet, if you were to open their dream journals, you would find this identical underlying narrative structure. They are being chased, they are falling, they are losing their teeth, they are appearing naked in front of a crowd.
It is startling. But this is where we have to be really careful not to romanticize it. The Tokyo teenager might dream of showing up at school without his pants. The Tibetan monk might dream of arriving at the monastery without his robes. The details differ. The surface level skin of the dream changes with the environment, but the substrate is identical.
But that adaptation is exactly what makes it so profound. It shows that the brain can translate a universal human experience into a local dialect. The Wall Street banker is chased by a faceless mugger in a dark alley. The Hadza hunter is chased by a predator in the forest. The chaser changes, but the neurochemical cascade of pursuit is exactly the same. It suggests we aren't just blank slates written on by our cultures. These aren't things we learned. The Inuit fisher didn't learn to dream about falling from a skyscraper, and yet they experienced that exact same vertigo.
See, I view that translation you're praising as a limitation, not a feature. It suggests the brain is lazy. It's not generating some new custom narrative for the banker. It's just taking a file called predatorchase.exe that was written, 200,000 years ago, and slapping an alleyway texture pack on it. It's a glitch in the system where the hardware hasn't caught up to the software update of modern civilization.
Glitch feels too dismissive. If something has persisted in the human genome for 200,000 years, across every single population on Earth, it isn't a glitch. It's a function. It has to serve a purpose.
Or it's a vestige, like the appendix. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's helping. The source material refers to this as the neuroscience of ancient fear. And that's the key word, fear. These aren't pleasant dreams we share. We don't all dream of the same field of flowers. We dream of the same terrors.
Okay, so let's look at the mechanism then, to see if we can find the utility. During REM sleep, the threat detection networks, specifically the amygdala and the limbic system, are firing intensely. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that handles logic and goes, hey, this isn't real, is largely shut down.
Exactly. The logic center is offline, and the fear center is just overheating. The brain is generating scenarios to simulate danger, social judgment, or failure, and this connects to the rehearsal theory mentioned in the text. The argument is that the evolutionary purpose isn't to tell a story, it's to practice. The brain is rehearsing how to respond to threats so that when you wake up, your reflexes are a little sharper.
And that makes perfect sense to me. It's a nightly training simulation. The text uses this really vivid analogy of an orchestra, which I think beautifully captures the complexity of what's happening. The brain is an orchestra playing the same symphony for humanity for 200,000 years.
It's a symphony of stress.
It's a symphony of survival. The score is composed by natural selection. Look at the sections of the orchestra described in the material. The violins are playing the fear of falling. We inherited that from our tree-dwelling ancestors. If you didn't have that fear, you fell out of the canopy and, well, you didn't pass on your genes. The dream keeps that reflex sharp.
But we don't live in trees anymore. That is my entire point. If I'm sleeping in a bed on the ground floor, my brain screaming at me that I'm falling from a branch isn't keeping my reflexes sharp. It's disrupting my sleep cycle with obsolete data.
But consider the cellos. They are rumbling with social exposure. This is the naked dream. For early humans, ostracism, being kicked out of the tribe, meant death. You could not survive alone. So the brain coded social embarrassment as a life or death threat.
Sure, and then you have the percussion section. That's the pursuit by predators. pounding away, rehearsing escape routes. The problem, again, is the context. The orchestra hasn't updated the sheet music. We are sitting here in climate-controlled studios, safe from leopards, yet the percussion is still pounding away for a saber-toothed cat.
A business presentation in your underwear might be the modern translation of being cast out of the tribe, but the physiological reaction is completely disproportionate. I see why you call it disproportionate, but I would argue it's actually highly efficient. The brain is just using a template. It takes a modern stressor, a presentation, and plugs it into the social death template. It uses the most powerful emotional tools it has to make sure you take the situation seriously. It's not a bug that you feel terror before a big speech. It's the brain hijacking your ancient circuitry to make sure you prepare.
That just sounds miserable. You're describing a system that uses trauma as a motivational poster. Prepare for your speech or you will die alone in the wilderness. That is not a helpful biological function. That is a panic disorder waiting to happen.
It's a high-stakes simulation. And it works.
Does it? Let's look at the specific symbols, particularly the exam dream. The text notes that even people who have never taken a major high-stakes academic exam, or people who haven't been in a school for 30 years, will dream of showing up to a final exam they haven't studied for.
That is one of the most fascinating specific symbols. It represents a test of worth, a test of competence.
It represents imposter syndrome weaponized by your own subconscious. I have friends who are experts in their fields, 40 years into their careers, waking up in a cold sweat because they think they failed a math test. What is the utility there? What are they rehearsing for? They aren't going to take a math test. It's just anxiety for anxiety's sake.
I interpret that differently. I think the exam is a check on hubris. It's a reminder of vulnerability. It keeps the successful banker or the esteemed monk humble by reminding them that competence is fragile. It forces a kind of systems check on your preparedness for life.
You are very generous to the brain. I look at the teeth dream and I just see pure biological horror. Losing teeth, crumbling in your mouth, pulling them out.
It's deeply unsettling, I completely agree. The source material suggested echoes a primal anxiety about aging, about weakness, or a loss of power.
It's visceral. In a hunter-gatherer society, if you lose your teeth, you can't eat the tough meat or roots. You become a burden on the tribe. You die. So the dream is about your body failing you. It's about becoming obsolete.
Exactly. It's about agency. Relationships and physical capability were the only currency our ancestors had. In those interdependent societies, losing social support or physical power meant losing access to food and protection. The brain treats these things as existential threats because, historically, they were. The text calls these dreams an emotional X-ray, exposing the shared architecture of human vulnerability.
And that X-ray reveals that we are terrified. That's what it reveals. It doesn't reveal some noble struggle. It reveals a baseline of panic.
It reveals that underneath our suits and our technology, we are all worried about the same fundamental things. Am I safe? Am I accepted? Am I tapeable? That is a profound connection. When I know that the Wall Street banker and the Hadza hunter both wake up sweating from a dream about losing their teeth, I see a bridge of empathy that wouldn't exist otherwise.
I'm not convinced that mutual terror is a very solid foundation for empathy. You're framing this as a spiritual connection, but the source material points toward a much, much darker conclusion.
This brings us to the existential twist.
The shift in perspective, yeah.
Right. The source material poses a really unsettling philosophical question. Are we all suffering from a kind of evolutionary PTSD?
That is a heavy concept. Evolutionary post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well, think about the definition of PTSD. It involves re-experiencing trauma, hypervigilance, and reacting to threats that aren't actually present. That is exactly what this universal dreaming is. The predators are gone, the rival tribes aren't waiting in the bushes to attack us, we have antibiotics, we have reliable food sources. And yet, every single night, the brain runs disaster simulations for a world that vanished 10,000 years ago. It is a profound mismatch. We have skyscrapers, moon landings, and the internet.
But our subconscious still thinks we are naked apes, one mistake away from starvation. We are sophisticated primates haunting ourselves with ancient ghosts. We are running threat software that is completely out of date, and we can't uninstall it.
But here is where the science takes a sharp, almost haunting turn. If we accept your premise that this is just outdated software causing us pain, we have to ask why it hasn't been selected out. Evolution is usually brutal about efficiency. If these dreams were truly useless energy drains, they should have faded away.
Evolution is slow. Culture is fast. We built the skyscrapers in the blink of an evolutionary eye. The brain just hasn't had time to catch up. And that's why I would argue we have this epidemic of modern anxiety.
Or perhaps the threats haven't vanished. They've just changed form. We don't have saber-toothed cats, but we have layoffs. We don't have rival tribes with spears, but we have social media mobs. The stakes feel the same to the internal system.
But the reaction is maladaptive. If I get laid off, I need to update my resume, not wake up screaming because I think I'm falling off a cliff. The falling dream doesn't help me navigate a corporate restructuring. The naked dream doesn't help me navigate a Twitter scandal. It just floods my system with cortisol.
It primes you for the emotion of the loss. It ensures you don't get complacent.
It ensures we are chronically stressed. It leads to the conclusion that consciousness, or at least this aspect of it, evolved for survival, not for truth. It certainly didn't evolve for inner peace. It evolved to keep you alive in a hostile world that wanted you dead. And it refuses to acknowledge that the world has become, for the most part, hospitable.
I see that perspective, and yes, it is bleak. But let me offer a counter-narrative to your evolutionary PTSD theory. What if these dreams are the only thing keeping us grounded in reality?
Reality? A dream about showing up naked to a math test is the opposite of reality.
It's the reality of our animal nature. We spend our days in air-conditioned boxes, staring at screens, pretending we are masters of the universe. We pretend we're purely rational, logical beings. But then we sleep, and the orchestra kicks in to remind us, you are small, you are fragile, you need your tribe, you can fall.
So you think we need to be humbled nightly by our own biology?
I think we need to remember what we are. If the banker didn't have those nightmares, he might forget he's human. He might forget that he is just as vulnerable as the hunter. The universality of the nightmare is the check on the arrogance of progress.
That is a very poetic way of justifying a nightly panic attack. I maintain that we are trapped in a simulation that is no longer accurate. We are paying an emotional tax for ancestors who died thousands of years ago.
Perhaps. But in paying that tax, we participate in the collective human experience. We are bridging the gap between our primitive past and our technological present every time we close our eyes. It's not just PTSD, it's history encoded in our neurons.
It's a history I would prefer not to relive every time I enter REM sleep. But you don't get a choice, and neither does the monk, or the fisher, or the teenager. And to me, there is something strangely comforting in that lack of choice. We are all in the same theater, watching the same scary movie, holding hands in the dark, whether we know it or not.
Comforting or terrifying? I suppose that depends on whether you enjoy the movie.
To summarize, fact number 7 reveals that our dreams are not just random firings of neurons. They are a shared heritage. Whether it's falling, losing teeth, or showing up naked, these symbols are the orchestra of our evolution playing on a loop.
And my position remains that this orchestra is playing a horror soundtrack that we don't need anymore. It's evidence of a biological lag. We are safe, but our brains refuse to believe it. And that dissonance is the source of much of our waking anxiety.
But in that refusal, we find a unity. We are all connected by our shared nightmares. It's a reminder that beneath the surface, we are all human, all vulnerable, and all surviving.
We're halfway through, and a pattern is starting to emerge. But fact number 6 pulls back the curtain on a secret that most people walk past every single day without ever noticing.
Welcome back to the debate. We are moving deeper into our countdown. Let's dive into fact number 6. We are continuing our journey through the extraordinary 10, and we're dissecting the most complex, really mind-bending elements of human sleep physiology.
It's good to be here. And, looking at the literature for this week, we are really stepping away from the purely restorative functions of sleep, all the feel-good stuff. And we're entering a territory that is scientifically fascinating, but, well, if I'm being honest, philosophically just deeply unsettling. We aren't just talking about memory or rest anymore. We're talking about control.
I thought the last one was wild, but this next fact changed my entire perspective. We're discussing a mechanism that is likely active in your body for nearly 2 hours, every single night. It is a state of total, absolute physical lockdown known as REM atonia.
Lockdown is a polite way of putting it. I prefer to look at the mechanics of what is actually happening. The brain effectively severs its connection to the voluntary muscles. It is the body's nightly mutiny. I mean, for a significant portion of our lives, our own physiology actively conspires to trap us inside our own heads.
See, and that's where we differ. Where you see a mutiny, I see perhaps the most elegant evolutionary failsafe in all of mammalian biology. We are analyzing fact number 6, the spooky paralysis. But my argument is that this isn't a trap at all. It is a critical safety protocol. It's the only reason the theater of the mind can operate without, destroying the physical body. It's not a prison, it's a seatbelt.
And that is the crux of the disagreement. I don't deny the biological utility. Obviously, we need it. But I deny that we should be comfortable with it. We base our entire sense of self on agency, on the idea that if I will my hand to move, it moves. That is the fundamental feedback loop of existence. And fact number 6 demonstrates that this connection is conditional. The brain can simply revoke your privileges to your own limbs whenever it sees fit.
When it manages the switch, it doesn't revoke the privilege permanently. But let's just look at the physiological necessity here. When we enter rapid eye movement sleep, or REM, the brain is not resting. This is a huge misconception. In fact, MRI scans showed that the brain in REM is often more metabolically active than the waking brain. It is just lighting up like a Christmas tree. I mean, the visual cortex is hallucinating imagery, the motor cortex is planning movement, the amygdala is processing intense emotion. If the brain is the director of a chaotic, high-stakes action movie, the body needs to be strapped into the seat, not jumping onto the stage.
But let's closely examine the nature of that seat. You call it safety. I look at the data and I see a total loss of executive control. The implications of REM atonia are that we spend years of our lives, years, if you add it all up, in a state of enforced helplessness. We are essentially consciousness locked in a vehicle where the doors are bolted and the steering wheel is disconnected, and the engine is still revving.
But you are ignoring why the wheel is disconnected. It's to stop the car from driving off a cliff. To really understand the stakes, we need to look at the specific mechanism detailed in the source material. We need to dissect the 3:42 a.m. scenario.
The 3:42 a.m. scenario, right. Yes, this is the part of the research that just makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up.
So let's set the scene for the listeners. It is 3:42 a.m. You are deep in REM sleep. In the dream narrative, you're in some kind of high-stakes situation. Maybe you're being chased by a predator, or you're sprinting to catch a departing train. Now here's the crucial insight from the neurophysiology. The source material confirms that your primary motor cortex, the strip of brain tissue responsible for voluntary movement, is not asleep. It is firing.
That is the terrifying part. It's not a simulation of movement. It's not a thought of movement. The motor cortex is screaming, run. It's generating the exact, distinct electrical patterns required to pump the quadriceps, swing the arms, and heave the lungs. The intention to move is fully formed. The command is fully transmitted. Your brain is not pretending to run. It is running.
Exactly. The neural command races down the corticospinal tract. Move, run, faster. It is an electrical storm of instruction. But here is the brilliance of the architecture. Those signals travel down the brainstem, but they never reach the muscles. They hit a biological firewall.
A firewall, a blockade. You have this profound disconnect where the mind is screaming for action and the body is just dead weight. If someone were to observe you at that moment, they wouldn't see the sprint. They wouldn't see the fight. They'd see a corpse-like stillness. The eyes might be darting under the lids, those sucker dick movements, but the somatic muscle tone is completely flat, flaccid paralysis. The captain orders full speed ahead, and the crew below deck has cut the transmission lines.
Well, it's not a cut line, it's a specific active inhibition. It's a filtration system. And the source material identifies the agent responsible. We aren't talking about magic here. We're talking about neurotransmitters.
specifically glycine and GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. These are the gatekeepers.
Chemical bouncers is a term I'd use. Very aggressive bouncers.
And effective ones. So these neurotransmitters are released from a specific cluster of neurons in the pons, that's part of the brainstem. They travel down to the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. And for the technical listeners, this is fascinating. They cause hyperpolarization of the motor neurons.
Right. And let's just clarify that for everyone. Hyperpolarization essentially means they lower the electrical charge of the neuron. So think of it like this. For a neuron to fire and make a muscle move, it has to climb a hill of electrical charge. Glycine and GABA basically turn that hill into a mountain.
Precisely. They raise the threshold for action. So even though the motor cortex is sending these loud run signals, those signals just aren't strong enough to overcome the negative charge created by the glycine and GABA. The signal, it just fizzles out at the spinal gate. It is a precise chemical intervention to ensure that when you dream of flying, you don't actually launch yourself out of your bed. It isolates the simulation from the hardware.
Okay, but I'm not arguing against the chemistry. The mechanism is clear. What I'm arguing about is the philosophical weight of that mechanism. We define intention as the precursor to action. If I really intend to punch, I punch. My will manifests in the physical world. But in REM sleep, the intention is biologically identical to the waking state. The motor planning is there. The will is there. But the execution is severed by a few molecules. It proves that the subjective feeling of choosing to act can exist in perfect isolation from the action itself. We are frankly deluding ourselves if we think we are the absolute masters of our biology. We are at the mercy of a chloride ion influx in the spinal cord.
You're framing this as a power struggle between the self and the biology. I argue that the biology is the self protecting the self. You say it's spooky that we can't move. I say it's miraculous that we can experience the thrill of flight, the terror of a chase, or the joy of dancing in a dream without risking a broken neck in reality. This paralysis allows the brain to simulate reality safely. It is the ultimate virtual reality rig with a physical safety lock. It lets us practice, to process, to experience, all without consequence.
But what happens when the lock breaks? You talk about this system as if it's foolproof, as if the bouncers never take a break. But the source material highlights a condition that completely undermines your whole safety protocol argument: REM sleep behavior disorder, or RBD.
That is a critical point. RBD is a serious pathology, but I would argue its existence actually proves my point about how essential the paralysis is.
No, it proves how dangerous the dream state is. In RBD, the chemical bouncers don't show up. The brainstem fails to release glycine and GABA properly. So that 3:42 a.m. scenario stops being a simulation. The patient physically acts out the dream. They aren't just twitching, they're executing the commands. They punch their partners, they thrash against the walls, they literally dive out of bed.
They get hurt, they hurt others. This demonstrates that the dream state is not some passive movie. It is a state of high motor arousal. The paralysis isn't a restriction, it's a necessity. Without it, every single night would be a physical battleground. I mean, imagine the chaos if 8 billion people physically acted out their dreams every night. Society would collapse. And there's a deeper insight here. From the source material regarding RBD, it's not just a sleep issue.
No, it's a warning sign. The literature suggests that RBD is often a prodromal marker, an early warning system for synucleinopathies like Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia.
Exactly. Because the brainstem circuits that control this paralysis are some of the first to degrade in those neurodegenerative conditions. It just highlights how high-functioning and complex the healthy brain must be to maintain that balance every single night. The fact that most of us don't act out our dreams is a testament to the system's robustness. It is a daily or nightly miracle of coordination.
I agree that RBD is destructive. It's a tragedy, but let's pivot to the other side of the coin, the horror side. What happens when the lock works too well? Or rather, what happens when the mind wakes up, but the bouncers haven't cleared the door yet?
Sleep paralysis.
Sleep paralysis. This is where the abstraction ends and the terror begins. This happens when you
regain consciousness. Your cortex is awake, but the brainstem is still pumping glycine into the spinal cord. You open your eyes, you can see your room, you can hear the traffic outside. You try to lift your arm, nothing. You try to scream, nothing. You are a statue with a heartbeat.
It's a temporary desynchronization. It's a lag in the system. The timing belt just slipped for a fraction of a second.
It is primal terror. And because the brain is still in a semi-dreaming state, it tries to interpret this paralysis. The source material details the incubus phenomenon. The brain feels a pressure on the chest.
Which is actually just the natural relaxation of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm's dominance during atonia. Your breathing is shallower in REM, and when you wake up to that without motor control, it feels like a weight.
Right, but the panicked brain doesn't know that. It feels pressure, it feels helplessness, and the amygdala is detecting a massive threat. So the cortex creates a narrative to explain the data. I can't move, and there is weight on my chest. Therefore, there must be a demon sitting on me. It hallucinates a monster to explain the physiology. This is why every culture in history has a sleep hag or nightmare myth. It is biology masquerading as a haunting.
Well, that is the brain attempting to make sense of conflicting signals. It's a prediction error. The amygdala screams danger because you're paralyzed, and the visual cortex projects an image to fit that emotion. It's a fascinating example of how our brain constructs reality based on internal states. But importantly, it is physically harmless. It passes in seconds or minutes.
Harmless physiologically, perhaps. Psychologically, it forces you to confront the reality that you are trapped in a machine that can malfunction. And this brings me to another point about this so-called mutiny. It's not just that we're paralyzed, it's that we're paralyzed and irrational.
You're referring to the status of the prefrontal cortex.
I am. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC. This is our logical gatekeeper. It's the part of the brain that says, wait a minute, elephants don't fly. Or, I probably shouldn't be naked in this classroom. It is the CEO of the brain, so to speak.
Right. And during REM sleep, the DLPFC is hypoactive. It's essentially offline. The CEO has gone home for the night.
So look at the combination you're praising. On one hand, the motor system is paralyzed by the brainstem. On the other hand, the logical center is shut down. We are stripped of our physical agency and our logical defense. We accept the most bizarre, terrifying, or nonsensical narratives without question, and we cannot move to escape them. That is not a safety protocol. That is a state of absolute vulnerability. You are helpless and you are gullible.
I see why you characterize it that way, but let me offer a counter-proposal regarding the hypoactivity of the prefrontal cortex. You call it a vulnerability, I call it a liberation.
A liberation to be irrational?
Yes. Think about it. If the logical gatekeeper were active, we couldn't dream. Not really. Every time a bizarre image appeared, the logic center would just shut it down. This isn't real. This doesn't make sense. That person has been dead for 10 years. We would be stuck in the mundane processing of the day. By taking the logic center offline and paralyzing the body, the brain creates a safe sandbox for hyperassociativity.
Hyperassociativity?
The brain can connect disparate memories, process complex emotions, run simulations that aren't bound by the laws of physics or social norms. The source material suggests this is crucial for creative problem solving and emotional regulation. We can link a memory from childhood with a problem from yesterday to find a solution. We sacrifice logic and movement to gain creativity and emotional healing. The spooky paralysis is the price of admission for the richness of the dream world.
A price. That's the word. It's a transaction.
It is an equilibrium. The brain values this internal processing so much that it is willing to take the risk of paralyzing the body for hours at a time. It isn't a mutiny, it's a dedicated maintenance mode where the external world is shut out, so the internal world can be repaired.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it ignores the subjective experience of the dreamer. You are looking at it from the outside, as a biological system optimization. Oh, the machine is in maintenance mode. But from the inside, if you become aware during that mode, it is horror. The 3.42 a.m. scenario isn't just data points. It's a person trying to run and failing. It's a person trying to scream and choking. That feeling of impotence,
of willing an action and having the universe refuse to answer is profound.
But that failure to run is exactly what keeps them safe in bed. If they succeeded in running, they would be charging into a wall. You're prioritizing the feeling of agency over the safety of the organism.
I am prioritizing the realization of what we are. This mechanism keeps the body safe, yes, but it reminds the mind that it is not in charge. That's my core argument here. REM atonia serves as a nightly lesson in humility. We walk around all day thinking we are the captains of our ships. We decide to grab a coffee, we grab a coffee. We decide to walk, we walk. But every night, biology reminds us, you are a passenger. You only drive when I let you drive.
That is an interesting philosophical take, though I would frame it differently. I don't see us as passengers. I see the brain as a dual processor. During the day, we process the external world, so we need motor control and logic. At night, we process the internal world. To do that effectively, we need to shut out the external. We shut down the inputs, sensory gating, and we shut down the outputs, atonia. It's not about humility, it's about efficiency. The brain is optimizing for a different task.
But the disconnect is so profound. The source material mentions that even the intention is generated. The motor command is real. I keep coming back to that because it's the smoking gun. It challenges the concept of a unified self. If the mind and body can be so thoroughly decoupled, are they really one entity? Or are we a ghost in a machine that occasionally gets locked in the attic?
They are distinct systems that usually cooperate. Sleep shows us the seams where they are stitched together. And yes, sometimes the stitching pulls apart, like in sleep paralysis or RBD. But for the vast majority of human history, for billions of people, this system works perfectly. You close your eyes, you have vivid adventures, you fly, you fight, you love, and you wake up rested without a single bruise.
Rested, perhaps, but maybe a little less confident in my own autonomy. I look at my hands a little differently today. I know that there's a chemical switch that can turn it off.
I think we have to agree that this phenomenon is one of the strangest balancing acts in biology. It is dangerous, yes, but necessary.
It is, and it brings us to a conclusion about what dreams actually cost us. We assume dreams are free entertainment, but the cost is total vulnerability.
So to summarize my position, REM atonia, or the spooky paralysis, is a non-negotiable requirement for the human experience. It's the equilibrium the brain values over excess. It protects us from ourselves while allowing us to explore the impossible. It is a biological masterpiece of inhibition.
And my position remains that while it may be necessary, it is deeply unsettling. It reveals that our control over our physical form is conditional. We are consciousness trapped in biology that can override us at a molecular level. It challenges the very definition of I acting on the world.
We can agree, however, on the trade-off. We sacrifice the ability to move in the physical world to fully inhabit the narratives of the dream world.
Yes, we trade our legs for wings, essentially, but we have to trust the pilot to give us our legs back in the morning.
And thankfully, the chemical bouncers almost always know when to step aside.
Almost always. That almost is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
That is a comforting thought to end on. We've covered the paralysis, the chemicals, and the terrifying disconnect of the 3.42 a.m. scenario. But the countdown continues and the stakes are only getting higher.
We are entering the top 5. From here on out, every fact we cover is a complete paradigm shift. Let's look at fact number 5, the discovery that changed how we define life itself. Welcome back. We are moving deeper into our countdown. Let's dive into fact number 5. Today, we are challenging one of the most fundamental assumptions of modern life, the way we sleep. We're conditioned to believe, from childhood really, that a solid, uninterrupted 8-hour block of rest is the gold standard of health. We treat waking up in the middle of the night as a failure, a disorder, something to be, medicated or fixed with white noise machines and blackout curtains. But the history of human existence tells a radically different story.
It certainly does. We're looking at the phenomenon of the 2.0 shift, or what historians call segmented sleep. The reality we're examining today, it
It takes us back to a time before the Industrial Revolution, before the light bulb, to a world where human beings slept in two distinct phases. It really forces us to ask if our definition of a good night's sleep is actually a modern invention or, well, maybe even a modern delusion.
We tend to view our modern habits as the peak of evolution. We assume that because we have memory foam mattresses and climate control, we must be doing it better than our ancestors. But here is where things take a sharp turn.
I mean, you can't really argue with the historical record on this one. For millennia, humans did not sleep in one long block. There was a first sleep that began shortly after dusk and a second sleep that lasted until morning. But sandwiched between them, you had this period of wakefulness, a watch, that lasted for an hour or two.
And my position is that this wasn't just a quirky habit or some, weird historical footnote. I look at this history and I see a tragedy of lost biology. I believe this segmented rhythm is the natural human state. We have ruthlessly suppressed it in the name of industrial efficiency. We've taken a natural pause, a sanctuary of time that existed roughly between 1 and 3 a.m., and we've just obliterated it. By eliminating segmented sleep, we have robbed ourselves of a critical period of spiritual and emotional processing that I think modern humans are starving for.
And I look at that same history and I see a successful, necessary adaptation. We have to be very careful about romanticizing the habits of the 1650s. Yes, our ancestors slept in two chunks, but I'm going to argue that that was circumstantial, not optimal. It was a coping mechanism for a world that was pitch black, freezing cold, and frankly, incredibly boring after the sun went down. Treating modern consolidated sleep as a loss ignores the immense benefits we've gained by conquering the dark. We aren't broken, we've just evolved our schedule.
Conquering is a very aggressive word for what we did to our circadian rhythms. But okay, let's paint the picture so the listeners understand the environment we're talking about. We need to visualize rural England in, say, 1650. It's winter. The sun sets at 4 p.m. The world doesn't just get dimmer, it disappears.
Right. And artificial light, as we know it, is non-existent. You have tallow candles, maybe, but let's be real about tallow candles. They are made of rendered animal fat, they smell bad, they smoke, and most importantly, they are expensive. You don't burn a week's wages just to sit up and stare at the wall.
Exactly. So you go to bed. Not because you're exhausted in the way a modern person is exhausted after a double shift, but because the world tells you it's time to rest. Your body, it synchronizes with the sunset. This isn't forced, it's a surrender to the natural cycle. You fall asleep early, say 7 or 8 p.m. Now, physiologically, if you go to sleep that early, your sleep pressure, the chemical buildup of adenosine in your brain, it dissipates after about 4 hours.
Which brings you to roughly midnight.
Precisely. You wake up naturally around midnight or 1 a.m., and this is the key difference between then and now. This awakening wasn't accompanied by the anxiety we feel today. It wasn't insomnia, it was expected. It was a planned, welcomed part of the night. My argument is that this rhythm allowed for a specific kind of consciousness that we just no longer access.
Okay, I don't dispute the mechanics. If you force me to go to bed at 7 p.m. tonight, I am absolutely going to be wide awake at midnight. I mean, I simply don't need 12 hours of sleep. But I challenge the idea that this surrender was some noble connection to nature. It was energy poverty. The historical accounts are clear. People went to bed to save money on candles and to stay warm under the covers because, central heating didn't exist. They didn't choose segmented sleep because it made them feel spiritually whole. They did it because they had no other options. To frame this as a lost sanctuary is projecting our modern desire for mindfulness onto a population that was largely just trying to survive a long, dark, cold winter.
That is such a cynical reading of the human experience. You're reducing human culture to pure economics. They were just cold, so they slept. Even if the material conditions necessitated the schedule, look at what humans did with that time. They didn't just lie there miserable waiting to pass out again. The midnight watch was a distinct cultural institution. This window between 1 and 3 a.m. was a time of unique activity that we have completely deleted from our lives.
Activity is a broad term. What exactly are we talking about here?
The records are specific. It was used for prayer,
recounting the day to God in the silence of the night. Think about the quality of prayer in absolute silence versus, in a busy church. It was used for intimacy. In fact, medical texts from the era explicitly note this was considered the most fertile time for conception. It was a time for processing emotions without the interference of the day.
It also mentions chores, though. It mentions checking the fire, mending clothes, or even visiting neighbors. That doesn't sound very spiritual to me.
But focus on the quality of that time. Imagine a world where you have a guaranteed hour or two in the dead of quiet, with no demands from your employer, no digital distractions, no blue light blasting your retinas, just you and your thoughts or you and your partner. We talk about the loneliness epidemic today, or the lack of deep connection in marriages. We have completely excised the one time of day that was historically reserved for pure connection and contemplation. We've replaced it with a sleeping pill to knock us back out because we're terrified of being awake with our own thoughts.
Hold on. I'm not sure I'd call visiting neighbors at 2 a.m. pure contemplation. That sounds more like a society that just operated on a completely different clock. And that's the crux of my disagreement. You're describing this watch as a sanctuary. I see it as a disruption. From a physiological standpoint, we know that sleep architecture, the cycle of REM and non-REM sleep, it benefits from continuity. Deep sleep and REM cycles are delicate. Breaking sleep into chunks might have been normal then, but was it restorative? Or were they just, chronically tired by our standards?
The evidence suggests they were quite rested. These weren't groggy zombies stumbling around the farm. They woke up alert. There's a specific hormonal state associated with that time of night. The body produces prolactin during these quiet, dark, wakeful periods. It's a hormone associated with relaxation and a feeling of peace. By forcing ourselves to sleep through that or stressing out when we wake up, we are skipping a natural state of meditative calm. We are chemically suppressing a period of peace that our ancestors took for granted.
But we have to look at the trade-off. You mentioned visiting neighbors. If I start visiting my neighbors at 2:30 a.m. in 2025, I'm not going to find a sanctuary of intimacy. I'm going to find the police at my door. The context has changed. You cannot transplant a 17th century sleep habit into a 21st century world and expect it to function. In a world where we have to be productive from 9 to 5, that midnight wakefulness is functionally detrimental.
And that brings us to the villain of the story, doesn't it? The light bulb. The Edison factor.
I would call it the hero of the story. The light bulb gave us our lives back.
The shift is undeniable, regardless of how you view the morality of it. Edison and the advent of industrial lighting declared war on the second sleep. By pushing our bedtimes later and later, from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. or midnight, we compressed our rest. We forced the body to consolidate those two natural blocks into one dense chunk. We are effectively doing it wrong, according to the hardware we evolved with. We're forcing a biological square peg into an industrial round hole.
Doing it wrong implies that evolution stops at the 17th century. Evolution is adaptation. Artificial light gave us back hours of productive, conscious life. It allowed for literacy to expand because people could read after work. It allowed for science, for art, for leisure. The shift to consolidated sleep was a response to having conquered the darkness. We no longer need to hide in bed at 6 p.m. Why should our sleep schedule remain tethered to the limitations of a tallow candle?
Because our biology hasn't caught up to our technology. That is the fundamental disconnect. We might have conquered the darkness socially, but our pineal glands, our circadian rhythms, our cortisol cycles, they're all still operating on the ancient software. We're living in a biological jet lag that never ends. And this leads to the most liberating part of this fact for anyone listening who struggles with sleep.
I agree that the reframing is interesting psychologically, even if I disagree with the biological imperative.
It's more than interesting, it's curative. Think about what we call middle-of-the-night insomnia. That specific experience of waking up bolt upright at 3 a.m. In the modern narrative, that is a disorder. It is a failure. It's something you mention to your doctor with a sense of shame.
Well, it certainly feels like a failure when you have a meeting at 8 a.m. and you're staring at the ceiling.
But why does it feel like failure? Because of the narrative. You wake up at 3 a.m., you look at the clock, you immediately think, oh no, I have to be up in 4 hours. If I don't fall back asleep right now, I'm going to be a wreck. What happens? Your cortisol spikes, your heart rate goes up, the anxiety itself keeps you awake. Now, imagine if you knew about the 2-0 shift. You wake up at 3 a.m. and you think,
This is the end of my first sleep. This is normal. This is my body doing what it has done for 10,000 years.
That is a compelling argument for reframing the reaction to wakefulness. I will grant you that. If believing in the 2-0 shift stops you from panicking, that is a net positive. The anxiety of not sleeping is often worse than the lack of sleep itself. If you can lie there and say, "I'm just in my watch," you might actually relax enough to fall back asleep. However, there is a practical limit to this.
What limit?
The limit of the alarm clock. If you embrace this watch and stay up for 2 hours reading or praying, and then fall back asleep at 5 a.m., but your alarm goes off at 6:30, you are going to be sleep deprived. You won't get a full second sleep. You'll just get a nap. You end up with 5 hours of sleep total, and that is not a recipe for health.
That's a critique of capitalism and our rigid work schedules, not a critique of the sleep pattern itself. You're blaming the body for not fitting into the factory schedule.
Perhaps. But we live in the world we live in. We can't simply wish away the 9 to 5 structure. The dissenter position here is that consolidated sleep, sleeping through the night, is actually a marvel of efficiency. It allows us to be fully awake and productive for 16 continuous hours. The segmented sleep of the past implies a much slower, more disjointed existence. Do we really want to go back to a time where the day was broken up by these long, dark pauses?
Efficiency. There is that word again. We optimize everything for output. But look at what we are losing in the input. The historical record highlights that the watched was a time for processing emotions without distraction. It was a natural sanctuary for contemplation. Today, when do we process? We consume content until our eyes close and we wake up to an alarm and immediately check our emails. We have no buffer. We have no silence. I would argue that many of our modern mental health crises, the chronic low-level anxiety, the feeling of being overwhelmed, stem from the fact that we have eliminated the brain's natural nightly debriefing session.
That is a heavy burden to place on a sleep schedule. You could argue that we can carve out that contemplation time during the day. We don't need to wake up at 2 a.m. to process our emotions. We could just put down our phones at 8 p.m. We could create that sanctuary without wrecking our RAM cycles.
But we don't, and perhaps we can't, because the day is filled with sensory noise. The middle of the night offers a unique neurochemistry. It's not just quiet time. It's a distinct state of consciousness that lies between dream and wakefulness, a liminal space. By medicating ourselves to stay unconscious for 8 hours straight, we are numbing ourselves to a part of the human spectrum of experience. We are essentially saying that being awake in the dark is scary, so let's drug it away.
I'm wary of romanticizing the liminal space of the 1650s. I think if you asked a peasant in 1650, "Do you enjoy your liminal space?" they might say, "I'm cold, I'm hungry, and I'm bored." The source text mentions that this period was used for chores. That tells me it wasn't all mystical contemplation. It was, well, I'm awake, I might as well mend this shirt or check the fire. It was utilitarian. It wasn't a meditation retreat. It was just life happening in the dark.
But even the utilitarian has a different quality in the silence of the night. Think about the simple act of mending a shirt by a dying fire at 2 a.m. There is a mindfulness to that which is impossible to achieve at 2 p.m. when the kids are screaming and the phone is ringing. And regarding the second sleep, historians note that it was often described as the sweetest, most vivid sleep. By skipping the waking interval, are we perhaps compromising the quality of the sleep that would follow? We push all our sleep into one block, and maybe the architecture is suffering. Maybe that's why we wake up tired despite getting 8 hours. We're getting quantity, but not the right rhythm.
That's speculative. Modern sleep science generally supports the idea that consolidated sleep is healthy, and that fragmentation is usually a sign of an issue, apnea, stress, etc. But I want to go back to the intimacy point you raised earlier, the most fertile time for conception.
Yes, it's a crucial point. It changes how we view family life in the past.
It makes sense logistically. Everyone is there. It's dark. There's nothing else to do. But you're framing it as a lost ritual of connection. I'd argue is just practical.
It was both. Think about the pressure it removes. In modern life, when does intimacy happen? Usually at the very end of the day when you are exhausted from work, or the very beginning when you are rushing to get ready. It's squeezed in.
The watch provided a pause where the only thing to do was connect. It wasn't the dessert after a long meal of work. It was the main course of that hour. By losing the 2 a.m. shift, we didn't just lose sleep, we lost a cultural ritual of unhurried connection. We lost the ability to just be with another person without a clock ticking nearby.
I can concede that we have lost rituals of unhurried connection. That is a fair point. But I would argue we should rebuild them in the daylight or in the evening rather than trying to dismantle the industrial sleep schedule. The solution isn't to force ourselves awake at 2 a.m., it's to create better boundaries in our waking life.
But the body is forcing us awake. That's the reality for millions of people. You call it insomnia, I call it the echo of the 2.0 shift. The historical facts force us to confront this. Is the body malfunctioning, or is society's schedule malfunctioning?
That is the fundamental question. If I wake up at 2 a.m., my body might be acting on an ancient impulse. But if my society demands I drive a car at 8 a.m., that ancient impulse is a liability. We have to live in the time we were born into. Adapting to consolidated sleep is part of surviving in the electrified world. We can't pick and choose which century we live in based on which parts seem cozy.
Surviving, perhaps, but flourishing? I'm not so sure. There is a sense of loss in this text, a lost sanctuary. I think deep down, many of us feel that loss. We feel the harshness of the alarm clock. We feel the unnaturalness of the glowing screen at midnight. The 2.0 shift reminds us that there was another way, a way that flowed with the darkness rather than fighting against it.
It reminds us that humans are incredibly adaptable. We adapted to the dark, and then we adapted to the light. I appreciate the history, but I don't want to go back. I like my 8 hours, I like my electric lights, and I think romanticizing the boredom of the dark overlooks the immense progress we've made in comfort and safety. We aren't freezing to death in the middle of the night anymore. That's a win.
To summarize, my position stands. Segmented sleep was the norm for millennia. The midnight watch offered spiritual and emotional clarity that the modern world desperately lacks. By forcing a biological square peg into an industrial round hole, we've created an epidemic of anxiety around sleep. We need to reclaim the sanctity of that waking hour, or at least stop treating it as a disease.
And my position remains, we shouldn't romanticize the limitations of the past. Segmented sleep was a response to a dark, cold, pre-industrial environment. We sleep differently because we live differently. Consolidated sleep is an adaptation that allows for modern productivity and efficiency. While the history is fascinating, insomnia in a 9-to-5 world is a functional problem, not just a spiritual opportunity.
Yet we both agree on the synthesis here. Understanding the history of the 2.0 shift fundamentally changes the experience of waking up at night. It transforms anxiety into context.
It does. It turns a medical failure into a historical echo.
The evidence for what we just discussed is undeniable, but it leads us to an even bigger question. Fact number 4 isn't just a theory. It's a visible, tangible miracle of the natural world.
Welcome to The Debate. Welcome back. We are moving deeper into our countdown. Let's dive into fact number 4. We are stepping away from the tangible statistics of the previous entries and moving into the architecture of the mind itself. We are grappling with a subject that fundamentally challenges our understanding of consciousness and perception, the nature of dreaming among those who are blind. So the central question we're wrestling with today is one of existence and fidelity. Does the absence of sight diminish the dream world, rendering it a lesser, sort of low bandwidth version of reality? Or does it reveal a hidden, richer dimension of consciousness that we, the sighted, have allowed to atrophy?
I have to admit, I thought the last one was wild, but this next fact changed my entire perspective. It forces us to ask, what does it actually mean to dream if you cannot see? I mean, I've always operated under the assumption, and I think most of the scientific literature, historically backs me up on this, that dreaming is by definition a visual hallucination. It's the visual cortex firing without input. So when I approach this material, I come at it with a heavy dose of skepticism. If you remove the primary sense that humans use to navigate the world, aren't you just left with
well, avoid?
I appreciate the skepticism because it highlights exactly why this fact is so disruptive. My argument is that the phenomenon of blind dreaming is the ultimate proof that the human brain is a sophisticated simulator of reality, not just some biological movie player. The evidence we're looking at suggests that these dreams are not missing anything. They're not defined by a lack. Instead, they are constructed from a completely different sensory toolbox that creates a fully immersive world, one that I would argue is actually more high fidelity in terms of physics and presence than, say, the visual cartoons our sighted brains conjure up.
That is a massive claim. To say it's more high fidelity feels like a stretch. Look, I'm approaching this as someone trying to comprehend the phenomenology of it. For a sighted person, it is nearly impossible to conceive of a dream without imagery. When we talk about dreaming, we're almost always talking about seeing things that aren't there. If I dream of a house, I see the walls, the color of the paint, the light coming through the window. My position is that without the visual cortex providing that spatial lighted reference, we are dealing with a fundamental redefinition of what a dream even is. It challenges the very definition of darkness versus an absence of visual reference. I'm just not convinced that a sound and touch simulation can rival the instantaneous, all-encompassing nature of a visual world.
I see why you think that. And it is the standard oculocentric bias. We prioritize the eye above all else. But let me give you a different perspective, one rooted in the neurobiology of the source material. You're assuming that when the lights go out, the show is over. But ask yourself this. When a sighted person closes their eyes, what do they see?
Well, they see black. They see darkness. Maybe some phosphenes, those little geometric lights if you press on your eyelids. But essentially, it's a black screen waiting for a signal.
Exactly. You see a black screen because your visual cortex is still active, expecting input and receiving none. Therefore, you assume the blind dreamer sees black in their dreams, that they are wandering through a dark room. But the material on Fact 4 contradicts this explicitly, and this is crucial. Those born with congenital blindness do not see images, true, but they also do not see darkness. Darkness is a visual concept. It is the status of lights off. If you never had the lights on, off doesn't mean anything.
Right, and that's a difficult concept to wrap your head around, the idea of nothing rather than block.
Think of it this way. What do you see out of your elbow? You don't see blackness out of your elbow. You just don't see. There is no visual field to be dark. That is the state of the congenitally blind dreamer regarding light. And here is where the science gets fascinating. That doesn't mean the visual cortex is dead.
Right, and that's where I struggle. If the hardware is there but the camera lens is broken, what is the brain doing with all that processing power?
It's being colonized. We call this cross-modal neuroplasticity. The brain is, it's ruthlessly efficient. It doesn't let prime cortical real estate, just sit empty. In blind individuals, the visual cortex often gets rewired to process sound and touch. So when they are dreaming, they aren't engaging in a lesser activity. They are firing up a massive amount of brain power to process spatial, audio, and tactile feedback.
Okay, I accept the plasticity argument. The brain reallocates resources. I get that, but I still question the result of that allocation. You called it a simulation of reality. But if I sit here with my eyes closed and imagine holding a cup of coffee, I can feel the heat and smell the roast. But I wouldn't call it a dream. I'd call it thinking or remembering. A dream implies a level of immersion where the internal world replaces the external one. Without vision, does the brain really have enough data to build a world that feels real?
It absolutely does. But you have to stop thinking of data as just photons. The source detail is fascinating here. Instead of images, the dream is built from sound, touch, movement, smell, and emotion. The brain isn't trying to paint a picture, it's trying to build a simulation of presence. And I would argue that presence is defined more by physics than by light.
Presence by physics. Unpack that for me, because to me, presence is identifying where I am. If I can't see the horizon, I don't know where I am.
You know where you are by how the environment reacts to you. Okay, so let's try a thought experiment here.
And I want you to really try to inhabit this perspective because it requires shedding your reliance on the eyes. Imagine you are standing in a room you have never seen, but you cannot use your eyes.
Okay, I'm standing there. My instinct is to reach out my hands because I'm afraid of hitting something. It feels claustrophobic.
That claustrophobia is your visual brain panicking. Push past that. You are simply there. Now, how do you know the size of the room? The material describes this beautifully. You don't experience the space as an absence of light. You experience it through sensory reconstruction. First, sound. But not just hearing a noise, we are talking about echolocation and acoustic reverberation. The text describes hearing the echoes, suggesting high ceilings.
I've read about that, but let's be critical here. To hear a high ceiling, that suggests a level of audio processing that feels, well, almost superhuman. Sighted people hear a sound, they don't hear the geometry of the room through the sound. Is the dream really that precise, or is that just a post hoc description of a feeling?
It's not post hoc. It is, immediate geometry. It feels superhuman to you because your brain filters that data out in favor of sight. Your brain is lazy with sound because it trusts your eyes. But the data is there. Sound waves are physical objects. They bounce. The source material talks about the acoustic deadness of carpet under your feet. Imagine that sensation in a dream. You step and the sound is just swallowed. You know instantly that you are on a soft surface, not because you look down, but because the acoustic signature of the room shifted.
I can concede the texture of the sound, sure. A tiled bathroom sounds different than a carpeted den, but the material goes further. It mentions specific details, like identifying the precise location of a ticking clock 3 meters to your left. That specificity is what catches me. In my visual dreams, details are often fuzzy. I might see a clock, but I don't know it's exactly 3 meters away. I just know it's over there. This implies a spatial awareness that is almost mathematical in its precision.
Precisely. That is the architecture of the blind dream. It is spatially rigorous because it has to be. Vision allows you to be lazy about distance. You just see it. Hearing requires a calculation of time delay, microseconds between the sound hitting the left ear versus the right ear. The blind dreamer's brain is running these physics calculations constantly, so when they dream, they are generating a world with accurate acoustic physics.
But isn't sound linear? That's my issue with calling it immersive. Vision is simultaneous. I open my eyes and I see the chair, the table, the window, and the sky all at once. Sound happens in time. I hear the clock tick, then I hear the footsteps. It feels like a fragmented way to build a world, compared to the instantaneous wholeness of sight.
I think you're underestimating the simultaneous nature of a soundscape. You don't just hear one thing at a time. You hear the hum of the fridge, the traffic outside, and the breathing of a person next to you all at once. And speaking of breathing, that brings up the social perception aspect from Fact 4, which I find incredibly profound. The ability to hear someone breathing across the room.
Right. That was the part that felt the most intimate to me. I'll grant you that.
It is intimate, but it's also diagnostic. The text says you know not just that they are there, but their exact distance and their emotional state through the rhythm of their breath.
That is a compelling argument for a different kind of richness. If I see a person in a dream, I might see a facial expression that tells me they are angry. But to hear the jagged, shallow rhythm of breath and know they are angry, that is a more visceral connection. It bypasses the deception of appearance. You can fake a smile, you can't really fake your autonomic breathing patterns while sleeping.
Exactly. It's a simulation of presence that is arguably more grounded in reality than a visual hallucination which can be distorted or surreal. Visual dreams often have impossible geometry, stares that go nowhere, faces that morph. The blind dream, as described here, tends to be hyper-realistic in its physics because it's built on the reliable laws of acoustics and touch.
I come at it from a different way, though. While I appreciate the acoustic detail, I want to talk about the tactile aspect, because this is where I get skeptical again. The source material uses this phrase, your skin reading the room like Braille. To me, that sounds like a lovely metaphor, but is it? Like functional biological reality? Skin isn't an eye, it doesn't have a lens, it has a very limited range.
It is incredibly functional, and it's my favorite concept in this entire data set because it challenges our definition of range. We think of touch as only happening when we make contact, but the text highlights the description of shifting air and air currents caused by movement. This represents a level of environmental awareness that sighted people filter out completely. When was the last time you noticed the air currents in a room without a fan blowing on you?
Unless there's a draft, it's invisible to me. I don't feel the air.
But the air is a fluid. It has density. When you walk toward a wall, the air compresses between you and the wall. This is a phenomenon sometimes called facial vision. Blind individuals can feel a wall before they touch it because of the pressure change on the skin of their face.
So you're saying in the dream, the brain is simulating air pressure dynamics?
Yes, it simulates the fluid dynamics of the room. That air current helps define the geometry of the space. It tells them where the door is, where the window is. And then there is the spatial poetry argument. The source suggests that vision might actually simplify reality to make it digestible, whereas the blind dream reveals the texture of it.
Simplify it. I would argue vision complicates it, with color, shadow, depth, perspective. Vision gives us the infinite.
But vision flattens things. You look at a wall, you see a flat surface. Maybe you see color. But the blind dreamer trails their fingers along it in the dream. The material details this. Knowing a wall's material, its temperature, its age.
Okay, hold on. Knowing the age of a wall by touch, that sounds like magic, not neuroscience.
Think about the physics. Old plaster feels different than new drywall. It's cooler, smoother, denser. Old wood feels different than fresh timber. The grain is raised, the moisture content is different. And knowing the time of day by how the surface absorbed heat, that is a profound connection to the physical world. You touch a brick wall in your dream, and because it's warm, you know the sun has been hitting it for hours.
I admit, the idea that heat absorption tells a story of time is elegant. It turns the environment into a clock. But I still have a reservation about the hierarchy of senses. This spatial poetry relies heavily on the brain prioritizing touch and sound. But what if the brain wants to see? This brings us to the crucial distinction in the text, the difference between congenital blindness and later life blindness.
A distinction that changes everything.
Right. Because if your theory about the sensory toolbox being superior, or at least equal, were true, wouldn't everyone dream that way? But the text clarifies that people who lose sight later in life can see in dreams for a long time. They draw on stored visual memories. This suggests to me that the brain prefers vision if it has access to it. It clings to the visual archive. If the non-visual dream was so high fidelity, wouldn't the brain switch to it immediately?
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes the brain has a hierarchy of preference rather than a hierarchy of habit and relevance. The transition you mentioned is key, and you have to look at the timeline. Over years, the visual imagery in the dreams of those with acquired blindness fades. It is replaced by the non-visual senses.
But isn't that fading a loss? That's my core skepticism. It sounds like a degradation of the signal. You start with a movie, and over time the screen goes dark, and you're left with just the soundtrack. That feels like entropy.
Oris, it is the brain optimizing for survival. The synthesis of this point is that the brain uses whatever input is most relevant now to construct its simulation. Why would the brain cling to a defunct sense? If I am blind, dreaming in pictures might actually be disorienting or irrelevant to my daily survival. A picture doesn't help me navigate my living room anymore. Sound and touch do. So the brain stops rehearsing the movie and starts rehearsing the spatial map.
That's a utilitarian view of dreaming, that it's a rehearsal for waking life. But dreams are also emotional processing, nostalgia, memory. If I dream of my childhood home, I want to see it as it was. If the visuals fade, am I losing that connection to my past self?
You might be losing the image of the past, but I would argue you are gaining the feeling of it. The brain is suggesting that the emotional and tactile truth of the memory is more durable than the visual snapshot. The text mentions that as the visual fades, the intensity of the other senses increases. So you aren't left with a blurry memory, you are left with a sharp, tactile memory. You don't see your mother's face, but you feel the exact warmth of her hand and hear the specific timbre of her voice.
That's a powerful distinction. It shifts the definition of memory from viewing a file to reliving an experience.
Exactly. And let's look at the brain scans mentioned in the broader research connected to this fact. When blind people read Braille, their visual cortex lights up. The brain is using the seeing part of itself to process touch. So in a way, they are seeing the tactile world. The dream isn't a retreat into darkness. It's a translation of the world into a language the brain can still read fluently.
So you're arguing that the visual cortex is merely a processor, and it doesn't care if the data comes from the retina or the fingertips.
Precisely. It deals in spatial relationships, whether those relationships are defined by light and shadow or by texture and temperature. The mental model is constructed all the same. The movie keeps playing, the medium just changes.
I suppose that speaks to the terrifying adaptability of the mind. It refuses to leave you in a void. It fills the space with whatever data it can harvest. It suggests that consciousness is abhorrent of a vacuum. If you take away the light, the mind amplifies the sound. It turns up the gain on the microphone.
That is a perfect way to put it. It turns up the gain. And that brings us to the conclusion of this analysis. Blind dreaming is not a void. It is not a blank screen. It is a fully immersive world built from senses sighted people barely notice. It proves that our consciousness is not dependent on light. It is dependent on information, and information comes in many frequencies.
I have to say, my perspective on darkness has shifted through this discussion. I used to think of darkness as an empty room, a zero state. Now I see it as a room full of echoes, textures, temperatures, and currents. It's not an absence of light, it's a presence of everything else. It challenges me to pay more attention to the non-visual parts of my own life. When I wake up tomorrow, I want to try and navigate just by sound for a moment, just to see what I've been ignoring.
And that is the beauty of this fact. It highlights the incredible adaptability of the human mind to construct reality from whatever tools it possesses. Whether those tools are photons or sound waves, the world the brain builds is equally real to the dreamer
Than the fiction.
Welcome back. We are moving deeper into our countdown. Let's dive into fact number 3.
Yeah, and we spent the last 2 segments really looking at the external world, the light, the temperature, and all that strange neurochemistry that primes the system. But we've been kind of dancing around the actual experience of the sleeper.
We have. But here is where things take a sharp turn. I thought the last fact was unsettling, but this next one, it fundamentally changes how we have to look at our own suffering.
That is a heavy setup for a countdown show. You are referring to fact number 3, the fear trainer.
The fear trainer. This is based on threat simulation theory, primarily championed by Antti Revonsuo. And it challenges the most intuitive assumption we all have about nightmares. When you wake up at 3 a.m., heart hammering against your ribs, soaked in sweat because you were just being hunted, your immediate assumption is that something went wrong.
Well, naturally, of course. We view nightmares as system failures. They're bugs in the software, or maybe just psychological torture, the brain misfiring and creating random noise that happens to be terrifying. If I buy a computer program and it screams at me, I return it.
Exactly. But fact number 3 argues that your reaction is backward. It argues that the nightmare isn't a glitch. It is a feature, a highly sophisticated evolutionary survival mechanism designed to keep you alive when you are awake.
I know this theory is popular in evolutionary psychology circles, but I have to admit I have always found it to be a bit of a just so story. It feels like we're trying to find this noble purpose for something that is, at its core, simply unpleasant.
I see why you might think it's just retrofitting logic onto chaos, but the biological evidence is actually quite stark. To understand it, we have to move away from this idea of a movie playing in your head and look at a different analogy entirely, the flight simulator.
Okay, let's unpack the simulator analogy. But I want to be clear, a flight simulator is a controlled environment. A nightmare feels like the absolute opposite of control.
Think about how a pilot learns to fly a 747. You do not put them in the cockpit with 300 passengers, send them up to 30,000 feet, and say, okay, let's see what happens if the engines fail. I mean, that's just too dangerous. Instead, you put them in a box on the ground, a simulator. And inside that box, you don't give them a smooth ride. You make their life miserable.
You introduce failures, wind shear, engine fires, hydraulic collapse.
Precisely. You simulate a crash over and over and over again. You force the pilot to face the worst-case scenario in a safe environment so that when and if it happens in reality, the neural pathways for the solution are already paved. Fact number 3 posits that your brain is doing the exact same thing during REM sleep.
So the argument is that while I am safe in bed, physically paralyzed, and, protected by my duvet, my brain is running survival drills. It's forcing me to practice threat evasion.
Yes, it's offline training for the online world.
Okay, but here is where I really struggle with this. If this is a training simulation, the design seems incredibly flawed. In a flight simulator, the pilot knows they're in a simulator. They retain their faculties. In a nightmare, the terror is absolute. I am not practicing, I am panicking. If the goal is instruction, why is the experience so visceral that it often leaves us shaken for the rest of the day?
That visceral nature is actually the key to the whole mechanism. If we look at the neurobiological architecture that's referenced in the source material, specifically the MRI studies on REM sleep, we see a very, very specific pattern of activation. It is not random.
You're referring to the decoupling of the frontal lobes?
Exactly. During these high-threat dreams, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, is firing at full capacity. It's running hotter than it does in most waking states. But simultaneously, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is effectively deactivated.
Which is the part of the brain responsible for logic, reason, and
reality checking.
Right.
The brain deliberately shuts down the skeptic. If your prefrontal cortex were online, you would just say, wait a minute, monsters aren't real. This is a dream. And the training value would be 0. You wouldn't react. By taking the logic center offline, the brain forces you to buy into the simulation 100%. You don't question the monster, you just practice the evasion.
That actually implies a level of deception that's somewhat disturbing. The brain is gaslighting itself for the sake of immersion.
But it is forcing immersion, yes, because survival reflexes aren't intellectual, they are emotional and physical.
But let's look at the physical side, because that leads to what the source material calls the mutiny. This is where the safety of the simulator becomes this very complex physiological trick.
The mutiny? This is just fascinating physiology.
Oh, it's a high-wire act. In the dream, you are sprinting. Your brain is generating the motor commands to run. The primary motor cortex is firing signals down the spinal cord that say, contract the quadriceps, pump the arms, run for your life.
As far as the motor cortex is concerned, you are running.
But if you actually ran, you would sprint into a wall or jump out a window. So the brainstem, specifically the locus coeruleus and the sublateral dorsal nucleus, stages a coup. It releases a flood of inhibitory neurotransmitters, specifically glycine and GABA, onto the motor neurons in the spinal cord.
It intercepts the message.
It's more than an interception, it's a blockade. The general orders the army to march, and the postmaster general burns the letters. You have this sleeper sprinting for their life, in their mind, experiencing all the terror and the exertion, while their physical body is chemically locked down, atonic, beneath the sheets.
And we know this mechanism is critical because of what happens when it fails. We see this in REM behavior disorder.
Right, where the glycine blockade fails and people physically act out their nightmares. They punch their spouses, they dive out of bed. It proves that the motor commands are real. The brain isn't imagining running, it is trying to run.
Which just bolsters the fear trainer argument. If dreams were just passive imagery, why would the motor cortex be firing full-force evasion commands? The system is clearly designed to practice the action of defense, not just the observation of it.
I will grant you that the mechanism supports the idea of activity, but does it support the idea of utility? This is where I want to push back on the evolutionary context.
The 200,000-year-old orchestra.
Yes, exactly, that concept.
The idea that we are playing a script that was written for the Pleistocene era.
It explains the content of the dreams. I mean, why do people in modern Manhattan or Tokyo dream about being chased by wild animals? Why is falling a universal nightmare? These aren't daily threats for us.
Because our ancestors spent eons running from predators and falling out of trees.
Exactly. Ravan Suo argues that this ancestral repertoire is hard-coded. The brain simulates the threats that were most likely to kill us for 99% of our history. It's predator evasion training.
But this leads to the mismatch theory, doesn't it? And this is my major gripe with the fear trainer. If my brain is training me to fight a wolf, but my actual threat is a hostile email from my boss, the training is useless. In fact, it's worse than useless. It's maladaptive.
How so?
Because the physiological response to a wolf fight, or flight, adrenaline dump, heart rate spike, is the exact opposite of what you need to handle a complex social negotiation or a financial crisis. If I wake up primed for physical combat, I am going to handle my modern stress poorly. I'm not being trained, I'm being given an anxiety disorder.
That is a valid critique, and the mismatch is certainly real. We are running ancient software on modern hardware. However, I would argue you're being a bit too literal about the wolf.
Okay, interpret it for me then. What is the survival value of that naked at work dream, or the back in high school and haven't studied for the test dream?
Well, those are simulations of social ostracization. For early humans, being cast out of the tribe was a death sentence. You could not survive alone on the savannah. The naked dream is a simulation of extreme social vulnerability and shame. It's a drill on how to navigate the threat of losing your social standing.
That sounds like a stretch. You are suggesting that dreaming I'm naked is helping me navigate office politics?
I'm suggesting that it strengthens the neural machinery for coping with shame and social threat. The specific scenario, the nudity, is just the interface. The underlying skill is emotional resilience under social pressure. The brain is toughening you up.
Toughening you up. That phrase, that brings us to the darkest part of this debate. Because there are millions of people who aren't toughened up by their nightmares. They are broken by them. We have to talk about trauma and PTSD.
This is, without a doubt, the most difficult counterpoint for the threat simulation theory to address.
It's not just difficult, it potentially falsifies the theory. If the brain is a benevolent trainer designed to help us master fear, then explain post-traumatic stress disorder.
In PTSD, the mechanism, it changes.
It doesn't just change, it creates a loop of suffering. A soldier returning from combat or a survivor of assault. They often don't dream of metaphorical wolves. They dream of the specific exact trauma. And they don't master it. They are re-traumatized by it, night after night. The simulator is just replaying the crash tape.
I acknowledge that in cases of severe trauma, the system is clearly malfunctioning. The simulation fails to integrate the memory, and it becomes a repetitive recording rather than a generative rehearsal.
But if the system is designed to survive, why does it have such a catastrophic failure mode? A trainer that forces a victim to relive their torture without any resolution isn't a survival mechanism. It's a pathology. It suggests that maybe the whole training idea is an illusion, and really the brain is just broken.
I'm not convinced that the failure of a system under extreme load proves the system doesn't exist. I mean, that's like saying the immune system doesn't exist just because autoimmune diseases happen.
But the immune system usually works. With nightmares, even for healthy people, the learning is questionable. Do I wake up better at running, or do I just wake up tired?
Well, there is the muscle memory argument referenced in the source material. Even if the dream is unpleasant, it strengthens neural pathways for rapid reaction. In the wild, reaction time is measured in milliseconds.
So the suffering is a price of speed?
Potentially. If a simulation can shave 10 milliseconds off your reaction time because you practiced recognizing a threat signal last night, that is the difference between life and death. Nature is strictly utilitarian. The evolutionary cost of a panic attack at 3 a.m. is negligible compared to the cost of being eaten by a predator at noon.
That is a bleak calculus. You are saying the system is calibrated for false positives. It is better to have 1,000 nightmares about threats that don't exist than to miss the one threat that does.
Exactly. It's better to be anxious and alive than relaxed and dead.
I suppose I can accept the evolutionary logic, even if I resent the experience.
But we should look at how the brain constructs these scenarios. Because you touched on something earlier, that the brain isn't just playing back memories, it's creating new ones.
Yes. This is the deep dive into the virtual reality of the mind. The source material, specifically the 2501.09350 paper, discusses the brain as a predictive machine.
This connects to the idea of generative models, right? Similar to the AI boom we're seeing now?
In a way, yes. When you are awake, your brain is constantly taking in sensory data, light, sound, touch, and correcting its internal model of the world. It predicts what will happen, and reality corrects it.
But when you sleep, the sensory input is cut off. The eyes are closed, the ears are dampened.
Right, so the brain is running on pure prediction. It is no longer constrained by reality. It is in sandbox mode. It takes the variables of your life, your stress, your memories, your fears, and it throws them into a generative model just to see what happens.
So it asks, what if? What if I am attacked? What if I fail? What if I am humiliated?
It is testing the boundaries of your model of the world. It's creating a virtual reality to stress test your own psyche.
Which explains why dreams are so often bizarre. The generative model is just hallucinating variables to see how the system responds.
Precisely. And this is why the feature versus bug debate is so important. If you view the brain as a passive recorder, the bizarre nightmare looks like a malfunction. But if you view the brain as a predictive engine trying to minimize surprise in the waking world, the nightmare's active work. It is data processing.
That brings up the cost again, though. Processing data requires energy. We're burning glucose, we're spiking cortisol, we are stressing the heart. There is a real physiological toll to this sandbox mode.
There is, but look at the flip side. Look at the source material regarding sleep deprivation and REM rebound. If you deprive someone of REM sleep, if you stop them from dreaming, they don't just get sleepy, they get unstable.
They get anxious, they get irritable, their ability to regulate emotion collapses, the pressure to dream builds up until the brain just forces it to happen. This suggests that the training, or at least the simulation, is essential maintenance.
So maybe the fear trainer isn't just about tigers, maybe it's about emotional calibration. If you don't run the simulation, the system becomes fragile.
That is the strongest argument for the theory. The fear trainer label emphasizes the survival aspect, but the mechanism serves to integrate our experiences. But the core tension of Fact 3 remains. We look at nightmares as victims. We say, I had a bad dream. Threat simulation theory says, no, you did a hard workout.
It is a massive shift in perspective. To view a nightmare not as a haunting, but as a rep, a set of heavy squats for your survival instinct.
Precisely. And that reframing changes the experience from victimhood to preparation. When you wake up sweating, you haven't been tortured. You've been trained.
I will say, even if I accept the theory, and I am still skeptical about how well it maps to modern life, I certainly don't have to like the instructor. The trainer is brutal. It uses our deepest insecurities as training props.
It does, but it knows you better than you know yourself. It knows exactly what buttons to push to get that visceral response. It has to be brutal to be effective. If the drill were easy, you wouldn't learn.
Which brings us right back to the mutiny we discussed. The fact that our body has to paralyze us to keep us safe from our own training regimen. It really highlights the intensity of what is happening. We are literally containing a riot every single night.
And that containment is fragile. As we discussed, when the chemicals don't quite line up, the barrier between the simulation and reality breaks down.
It really makes you wonder about the architecture of consciousness. We spend roughly a third of our lives sleeping, and a significant portion of that in REM. If Fact 3 is true, we aren't just resting. We are living a second secret life where we are constantly fighting for survival.
A secret life that ensures we can live our actual life. That is the beauty of it.
Beauty or horror? I suppose it depends on what you dreamt about last night. If I dream about a sunny beach, I assume the trainer decided I needed a rest day.
Or it's simulating a different kind of reward path. But yes, mostly the trainer deals in fear. Fear is the most potent teacher.
Well, next time I wake up in a panic because I showed up to this recording without my notes and without my pants.
You should thank your amygdala for the rehearsal. It means you care about the show. and you'll be extra prepared today.
I suppose I will, though I might need an extra coffee to handle the training fatigue.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Fact 3, I think it is worth reflecting on how much this changes the narrative of sleep. It's not passive, it's active work.
It certainly is. And it sets a high bar for what comes next. If this, the idea that we are trapped in a biological flight simulator every night, is just number 3, I'm bracing myself.
You should be, because as complex as the fear trainer is, it's really just a mechanism. It explains the how, but it doesn't fully explain the logic of the entire machine.
We are getting close to the top of the list.
We are down to the final 2. The tension is building because fact number 2 sets the stage for the absolute pinnacle of our countdown. This is the logic that holds the entire system together.
Welcome back. We are moving deeper into our countdown. Let's dive into fact number 2.
And I have to say, if the previous facts on our list were about, observing the brain or understanding its architecture, this one feels fundamentally different. This is about actively interfering with it. We are crossing a very distinct line today.
See, I think interfering is a loaded word. I'd call it partnering. We are talking about the era of dream engineering. For centuries, human beings have treated dreams as these mystical, untouchable messages from the divine or the subconscious, accessible only after we woke up and scrambled to scribble them down. But fact number 2 is that the wall between the waking mind and the dreaming mind, it's officially fallen. We now have the technology to interface, influence, and even decode the dreaming mind in real time.
And that is exactly what worries me. I mean, we are talking about targeted dream incubation, or TDI. We are talking about devices like the Dormio from MIT and high-level fMRI decoding that can literally put a picture of your dream on a computer screen. You see a frontier for creativity and problem solving. I see the invasion of the last private sanctuary of human consciousness.
Okay, I see why you think that, but let me offer a different perspective. This isn't about invasion, it's about utilization. For history's greatest thinkers, the dream state wasn't a sanctuary to be left alone. It was a resource they were desperate to tap into. We know that Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Salvador Dali, they all obsessed over the state of hypnagogia. That's that fuzzy, surreal transition period between being awake and being asleep, technically known as stage N1 sleep.
Right, the famous steel ball technique. It's a classic story, but I think a lot of people miss the actual biological mechanism behind it.
Exactly. It's such a brilliant analog solution to a biological problem. So Edison would sit in a chair with a heavy steel ball in his hand. As he drifted off, his muscle tone would relax, a phenomenon called atonia that happens as we slide into sleep. And well, the ball would drop, hit the floor, and the clang would wake him right up. He'd immediately write down whatever creative associations his brain was making in that fluid state. He knew the brain was doing something special in there, hyper-associating, breaking down rigid logic. He just needed a way to catch it before he fell too deep and, the amnesia of the night took over.
It's a charming anecdote about a man and a ball using gravity. But we aren't talking about gravity anymore, are we? We're talking about algorithms. And there is a massive difference between accidentally waking yourself up to catch a thought and having a machine programmatically insert thoughts into your head.
Well, we are talking about the Dormio device, which is essentially the high-tech evolution of Edison's steel ball. The researchers at the MIT Media Lab realized that they could track physiological signals, specifically heart rate, muscle tone, and electrodermal activity, to pinpoint the exact millisecond a person enters that hypnagogic state. But instead of just jarring them awake to see what they were thinking, the device plays an audio cue, a specific word. In the landmark study, I believe they used the word tiger.
And the results were admittedly effective. I'll give you that. The subjects didn't just hear the word, they actually incorporated it into the dream narrative. They reported seeing, tigers playing volleyball or tigers stacking books in a library. The external stimulus bypassed the sensory gate and planted a seed in the dream.
It proved that inception, in a real scientific sense, is possible. You can guide the content of a dream. But more importantly, and this is the key insight for me, The subjects who underwent this targeted dream incubation performed significantly better on creative tasks afterwards, specifically something called the alternative uses task, where you have to come up with novel uses for a common object like a brick or a paperclip. The group that had their dreams engineered showed a massive boost in creative flexibility compared to those who just napped or stayed awake. This proves the dream state is a tool for innovation that we can actively harness.
See, I come at it from a totally different angle. You're celebrating the efficiency of the hack, but I'm looking at the biological cost. You mentioned hypnagogia, stage N1. That is a very shallow, unstable state. It is not the deep, restorative REM sleep where all the heavy lifting of emotional processing happens. My concern is that by turning sleep into a kind of workplace for creativity, we are disrupting the essential biological functions of the sleeping brain.
But we aren't replacing a full night's sleep with this. We're talking about utilizing a specific, very short transition window. It's 20 minutes of a nap. It's microdosing sleep for macro results in creativity.
But here is where things take a sharp turn. We have to look at the TV effect. This is a piece of historical data that I find absolutely haunting because it shows just how malleable we really are. In the mid-20th century, researchers found that a huge percentage of the population started reporting that they dreamed in black and white.
Right, because of television.
Exactly. The dominance of black and white media literally rewrote the texture of people's subconscious. Later, of course, when color TV became standard, dreams returned to Technicolor. Now that proves the brain is impressionable, yes, but it also proves that our internal world is incredibly fragile. If passive exposure to a television set could bleach the color out of a generation's dreams, what happens when we strap active interference devices to our wrists? We are inviting external inputs into a system that is, by design, supposed to be isolated.
I'm not really convinced by that line of reasoning, because the TV effect was an accidental byproduct of media consumption. TDI is intentional, it's controlled, and we have to address the 90% erasure. You know as well as I do that the brain is designed to forget dreams. Roughly 90% of dream content just vanishes within 10 minutes of waking because of how the hippocampus encodes, fails to encode memories during sleep. That is a massive amount of data, of insight, of emotional processing that is just deleted.
Or it's filed away. Just because you can't consciously access it doesn't mean it didn't happen or that it wasn't useful. The brain is doing its housekeeping. You don't need to see the trash being taken out to know the house is cleaner.
But it's lost to the conscious mind. We have this incredible engine of hyper-associativity running all night, making connections between distant memories, solving problems in these non-linear ways. And then the hippocampus just wipes the whiteboard clean. Dream engineering is simply trying to hit save before the file gets deleted. I mean, if we can prompt the brain to remember the solution it found or the creative connection it made, aren't we just optimizing the human machine?
That assumes the whiteboard is meant to be saved. This is the dream decay phenomenon. But let's get technical for a second about why we sleep. During REM sleep, the brain actively downregulates neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, which is essentially the brain's stress molecule. It creates a kind of neurochemical bath that's completely distinct from wakefulness. This low-stress environment lets us process high-stress memories without the physiological panic. That's the emotion assimilation theory.
So your argument is that by introducing these prompts, we're reintroducing stress.
Precisely. If you start injecting waking demands like solve this problem or think about this product, you are reintroducing the very stress chemicals that sleep is designed to wash away. You're effectively denying the brain its nightly detox. You might get a more creative paperclip idea, sure, but you might also wake up with higher anxiety because your brain never got a break from being on. We see this in sleep deprivation studies. The first thing to go is emotional regulation.
That's a compelling argument for, say, healthy individuals just looking for a productivity boost. But have you considered that we aren't just talking about productivity? We're talking about therapy. This isn't just about helping a designer come up with a new chair. This is about people suffering from PTSD.
Okay, I agree that the therapeutic angle is the strongest defense for this technology.
It's more than a defense. It's a moral imperative. I mean, look at imagery rehearsal therapy, or IRT. For people with nightmare disorders, their sleep isn't a detox, it's a trauma loop.
They are re-experiencing horror every single night because that memory processing function is broken. The ability to engineer that dream, to rewrite the script while they are awake, and then use cues to guide the dream toward a neutral or positive outcome, that is life-saving. If we can use TDI to stop a veteran from reliving a combat scenario, are we really going to argue about the purity of the sleep state?
It is absolutely fascinating work. In a clinical setting with a therapist, I am on board. Absolutely. But you know as well as I do, this technology won't stay in the clinic. The Dormio software is open source, the techniques are out there, and when we talk about decoding dreams, we are moving from influence to surveillance. We need to talk about the work coming out of the Kyoto and ATR laboratories, because that shifts the conversation from writing dreams to reading them.
It is absolutely fascinating work. They're using fMRI machines to measure blood oxygen levels in the brain, the bold signals, while a person sleeps.
Explain the bold signal for the listener, because this is the mechanism of the mind reading that people find so unsettling.
Sure, BOLD stands for blood oxygen level dependent imaging. Basically, your neurons don't have their own internal energy reserves. When a specific cluster of neurons fires, say the part of your visual cortex that recognizes a shape, it needs a rush of oxygenated blood. The fMRI creates a magnetic map of where that blood is flowing. The researchers in Kyoto took this map, woke the person up, asked what they saw, and then fed that data into a deep neural network. They do this hundreds of times. I saw a bird. I saw a car. And over time, the AI learns to correlate specific patterns of blood flow with specific visual imagery.
It's impressive, but we need to be very precise about what it's actually doing. It is not playing back a 4K movie of your dream. It's probabilistic guessing based on training data.
It's getting closer than you might think, though. The AI can reconstruct visual elements. It can look at the brain scan and say, this person is seeing a person, or this person is seeing a building, or even this person is seeing a letter. It is decoding the visual categories of the subconscious in real time. It turns the subjective experience of a dream into objective data. In some of the output images, you can clearly see the silhouette of a bird or the shape of a letter that matches what the dreamer reported.
It identifies categories. Yes, it identifies girl, car, road. But a dream is not just a list of nouns. It is the qualia, the emotional texture, the narrative context. In a dream, a car isn't just a car. It might represent your father, or a sense of escaping, or a memory of a crash. The AI sees the object, but it completely misses the meaning. And my fear is that we will confuse the map for the territory. We will look at these AI reconstructions and think we have solved the dream while missing the internal reality of the dreamer. We're reducing the most complex human experience to a game of Pictionary.
But that's true of any translation, isn't it? We are translating neural activity into images. It's a first step. And think about the committee of sleep, the idea that our dreaming mind is a council of experts working on our problems. If we can decode the visuals, we might be able to understand how the brain constructs these narratives. We could see visually how the brain takes a memory from 10 years ago and splices it with a conversation from yesterday. It's the ultimate window into memory consolidation. We could literally watch a memory being stabilized.
It's also the ultimate window for advertisers.
Ah, I thought we might get here.
We have to. If you can influence a dream with a sound cue, tiger, and you can decode what a person is dreaming about, you have the two components needed for a closed-loop system of manipulation. Advertisers are already talking about ad injection. The Coors Light experiment is not science fiction. It happened. They played soundscapes to induce refreshing dreams of waterfalls and mountains in exchange for a free 12-pack of beer.
Come on, it was a marketing stunt. It wasn't mass mind control.
It was a proof of concept. The continuity hypothesis states that our dreams reflect our waking concerns. If we allow corporations to insert their concerns into our sleep, we are breaking that continuity. We are losing the self-knowledge that comes from analyzing our natural anxieties. If I dream about falling, maybe I'm feeling insecure in my career. If I dream about a refreshing beverage because a machine whispered it to me, I learned nothing about myself. I've just been programmed.
I think that's an extreme extrapolation. The technology is currently a tool for researchers and individuals who want to explore their own minds. The steel ball has become an algorithm, yes, but the intent is the same, to expand human potential. We are seeing athletes use sleep for motor visualization, rehearsing a ski jump while in stage 2 sleep. We are seeing students use it for language retention. The brain is doing this work anyway, we're just providing a focus. Why leave such a massive part of our life to chance?
But the brain does that work in a very specific, protected chemical environment. You mentioned athletes. There's research suggesting that when sleep is compromised, even by productive stress, it leads to maladaptation. Athletes who don't get that pure, unadulterated downtime suffer more injuries and mood disturbances. If we turn sleep into a second shift, we might find that we're more creative in the short term, but more fragile in the long term. Evolution spent millions of years refining the sleep cycle. I'm hesitant to think we can fix it with an app and a wristband.
I would argue that understanding is not the same as fixing or breaking. We're demystifying a biological process. For thousands of years, we looked at dreams as this foggy, magical experience. Now, thanks to the combination of sensors, fMRI, and AI, we see it for what it is, a biological mechanism for memory integration and emotion processing. And like any biological mechanism, it can be optimized. We can partner with it.
Optimized, that's the word that scares me. You can optimize a machine, you can optimize software, but human consciousness? The 90% eraser might be there for a very, very good reason. Maybe we aren't supposed to remember every connection. Maybe the forgetting is what keeps us sane. If we remembered every fleeting, bizarre association our brain made at night, we might lose our grip on waking reality.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The forgetting is a limitation of the hardware. The hippocampus can't hold on to everything. But if we can selectively save the breakthroughs, the Frankenstein idea of Mary Shelley, the Yesterday melody of Paul McCartney, then we are enriching waking life. We aren't tearing the door down, we are just installing a window, and maybe a small handle to open it when we need to.
I just worry that once you install a window, you can't control who looks inside. And once you install a speaker, you can't control who speaks into it. We have the ability to knock on the door of the dreaming mind, absolutely. That is fact number 2. But we need to be very, very careful about who we let in. The subconscious is the engine room of the self. If we start letting strangers or algorithms turn the dials, we might not like where the ship ends up.
And that tension between the incredible utility of the technology and the sanctity of the dreaming mind is exactly why this field is exploding right now. We are standing on the edge of a world where we don't just experience sleep, we curate it. It's exciting, and yes, it requires caution.
A curated sleep. It sounds beautiful and dystopian all at once.
Which brings us to the end of fact number 2. We have seen how the brain can be influenced, how it can be read, and how the line between internal and external reality is blurring.
But as much as we have covered, we have been dancing around the center of the maze. We've talked about the mechanics, the chemistry, the technology. We've talked about what we can do to the brain.
Stop. Before we go any further, we have reached the moment we've been building toward for the last 2 hours. Fact number 1 is the reason this podcast exists. It is the holy grail of this entire subject. Everything we have discussed, from the network to the chemical warfare, all leads to this one final, staggering truth.
Are you ready?
This is the most extraordinary fact of them all.
Welcome to the debate. Before revealing fact number 1, we must pause and acknowledge the journey. We have finally reached the summit. Everything we've discussed so far, it has all been leading to this one staggering revelation. This is the fact that changes the entire story of the human mind.
It really is. This is the final piece of the puzzle. We've looked at the biology, the history, the psychology, but this one forces us to reconsider the very definition of consciousness.
Fact number 1 is this. The sleeping brain is not a passive void. It is a high-speed, intelligent editor and simulator that we can now physically interface with. We have moved from the era of simply observing sleep to Well, to the era of communicating with it. We are literally reading dreams via fMRI and writing to them via targeted dream incubation.
And that is the headline, yes. But while I agree the technology is groundbreaking, I think we need to be extremely careful with that word, communicate. You see the sleeping brain as a hidden genius, just waiting to be unlocked. I see a biological maintenance system that, for very good evolutionary reasons, has a big do not disturb sign hanging on the door.
But that sign is coming down, whether we like it or not. I mean, for decades, the prevailing wisdom was that sleep was akin to a coma, with, occasional hallucinations. But if you look at the data, specifically the recent work on dream decoding and incubation, we have to admit that the sleeping brain is arguably more active than the waking one. It's a superpower we've been ignoring.
Active, yes. A superpower? I think that's a bit of a branding exercise. I tend to view it more as a janitor. A very efficient, very high-speed janitor, but a janitor nonetheless. And, well, interfering with the cleaning crew usually results in a pretty messy building the next day.
I see why you'd use that analogy, but it implies the brain is just sweeping up dust. The data suggests it's doing something far more complex. It's not just cleaning, it's curating. We have this concept now of the infinite library. During sleep, specifically in NREM and REM cycles, the hippocampus acts like a high-speed librarian. It reviews all the day's files, it discards the noise, and it stabilizes the important memories by replaying neural patterns.
You're talking about hippocampal replay.
Exactly. And the mechanics of this they're just mind-blowing. When we observe this in lab settings, using rat models, running mazes, for instance, we see that when the animal sleeps, the neurons that fired while it was running the maze, they fire again. But here is the key. They don't fire in real time. They fire in fast forward.
It's temporal compression.
Right, the brain compresses the experience. So if the maze took a minute to run, the replay happens in a fraction of a second. Over and over hundreds of times, this is high-speed data compression. It's taking a raw file and burning it onto the hard drive of the cortex. That isn't just maintenance, that is active construction of your entire knowledge base.
I agree with the mechanism. The replay is real, the compression is real, but I disagree with the intent you're ascribing to it. You're framing this as building the library. But let's look at the other side of that coin, the nighttime detox, or what we call the glymphatic system. This is the physiological reality of what happens while that replay is going on. We know now that during deep sleep, neurons physically shrink by 60%.
Right, which allows the cerebral spinal fluid to flow through.
They literally shrivel up. It's a radical biological change, and this allows the fluid to wash away toxic proteins like beta amyloid and tau. This, to me, proves a process is primarily about removal, not addition. The brain is taking out the trash. And this brings me to my core objection to your whole superpower narrative, the 90% eraser.
You're referring to dream decay.
I am. We know for a fact that the brain intentionally deletes about 90% of dream content within 10 minutes of waking. If this was an infinite library meant for us to access, why is the door locked? Why is the retention rate so abysmal? This forgetting isn't a failure of memory, it's a feature. The system is designed to flush this data. If the brain wanted us to read these so-called books, it wouldn't burn them the moment we opened our eyes.
I'm not convinced by that, though, because it assumes that conscious recall is the only measure of value. Just because you don't remember the dream doesn't mean the work wasn't done. The software update was installed, even if you didn't read the patch notes. The synaptic strength was changed. The memory was consolidated. You woke up smarter, whether you remember the lesson or not.
Or the patch notes were gibberish to begin with. You're assuming the content of the dream, the narrative, is the point. I'm suggesting the narrative is just the noise the machine makes while it cleans itself.
Okay, let's test that noise hypothesis. If dreams were just random neural firing or, cleaning fluid washing over circuits, they wouldn't have structure. But they do. Specifically, they have thematic structure. And this brings us to threat simulation theory. We see the same patterns across cultures, across generations: falling, being chased, appearing naked in public.
The universal nightmares.
Exactly.
Why would a janitor paint the same pictures for everyone? If it was random noise, I'd dream of blue static and you dream of geometric shapes. Instead, we both dream of missing a final exam. The brain is running a flight simulator. It's virtual reality training for survival. It generates these high-stakes scenarios, a predator, a social catastrophe, so we can practice our emotional and behavioral responses in a safe environment. That is intelligent design, not random waste removal.
That's a compelling argument, but it kind of falls apart when you look at the actual architecture of REM sleep. Have you considered the concept of hyperassociativity?
It's the state of heightened connectivity, sure.
It's more than that. I mean, think of your waking brain like a Google search. You type in dog, and the algorithm filters the garbage and gives you golden retriever or puppy. It follows a logical, linear path. In REM sleep, that logic filter is turned off. It's like hitting I'm feeling lucky on a broken keyboard. The brain connects dog to toaster because of some vague, nonsensical neural pathway, and then to my third grade teacher.
But that chaos is creativity. It's lateral thinking.
It's noise. In waking life, our narratives have a linear graph structure. In REM, that structure breaks down into chaos. Finding training in that chaos is like staring at static on a TV and seeing a face. We are human, we are pattern-seeking machines. We project meaning onto everything. And if this system is a simulator designed to save our lives, frankly, the code is terrible.
How so?
Because it crashes way too easily. I mean, look at the impact of diet. Recent studies on unhealthy diets, specifically high sugar and saturated fat, show they directly impact sleep microstructure. They reduce deep sleep, they alter delta and theta power. The system is so easily corrupted by what you ate for dinner. If this was some sophisticated flight simulator designed to save us from predators, you'd think it would be robust enough to handle a cheeseburger. Instead, the software glitches the moment the biological fuel is slightly off. That suggests it's a biological organ struggling to maintain homeostasis, not some high-tech training program.
I think you're conflating the hardware with the software there. Of course, the hardware needs good fuel. If you put bad gas in a Ferrari, the engine knocks. That doesn't mean the Ferrari isn't an engineering marvel. But let's move to the evidence that we can actually watch this software running. This is the summit I mentioned in the intro. We aren't just guessing about dream content anymore from journals. We are decoding it, physically.
You're referring to the Osaka fMRI studies.
I am, specifically the work titled Making Your Dreams a Reality. This is the most sci-fi reality we have. Researchers put subjects in an fMRI scanner, scanned their brain activity during sleep, and then successfully converted those blood flow signals into video.
Please don't tell me you're hanging this whole argument on the stable diffusion paper. Because if you are, we have to talk about how that decoding actually works. It's not magic.
It's not magic, it's math. But the methodology is incredible. They didn't just scan sleeping people. First, they spent hours scanning the subjects while they were awake, showing them thousands of images, a clock, a person, a train, and mapping exactly how their visual cortex fired for each one. They built a dictionary of that person's brain.
Right, they trained the model.
Then, when the subject went to sleep, the fMRI watched for those same patterns. But here's the breakthrough. They used two different neural networks, a low-level manipulation network to capture the basic shapes and colors, and a high-level guiding network to capture the semantic meaning, the concept of the object.
And that is where the whole telepathy claim starts to get really shaky.
I disagree. The system took those neural signals and used a generative AI, similar to the tech behind Midjourney or DALL-E, to reconstruct the image, and then they used large language models like ChatGPT to bridge the visual fragments into a script. They effectively turned a dream into a video story with audio. We are at the point where we can play back a dream on a screen.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy the playback narrative. Let me tell you why. You're glazing over the role of the AI in the middle. You said they use the AI to bridge the fragments. That phrase is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
It's filling in the gaps, sure.
No, it's not just filling gaps. It's hallucinating a narrative onto biological data. Think about how these models work. If I tell ChatGPT, describe a scary dream about a dog, it gives me a story based on its training data, on millions of stories it has read. It invents a plot. In this study, the fMRI signals just the prompt. The brain says dog and fear.
The AI then writes a movie scene about a dog attacking.
But the prompt came from the dreamer's brain.
The prompt did. The story did not. We aren't seeing the dream as the dreamer saw it. We're seeing an AI's interpretation of fMRI signals smoothed over to look like a movie. It's the map, not the territory. If I show you an ink blot and an AI writes a story about a butterfly, did I decode the ink or did I just create a story?
I think that's too cynical. The ink here is the visual cortex firing in specific mapped patterns. If the fMRI detects the neural signature for clock and tower, and the AI generates an image of Big Ben, that is an accurate decoding. We are finally building a translator for a language we haven't spoken before. And we aren't just listening, we are starting to speak it back. This is the second half of fact number 1, targeted dream incubation.
The Dormio device.
Yes, if the fMRI is reading, Dormio was writing. The sleep tree experiment is the definitive proof that we can inject code into the sleeping brain.
Walk us through the mechanism, because injecting code sounds pretty invasive.
It's surprisingly simple. They utilize the hypnagogic state, that twilight zone between wake and sleep, stage N1. They put sensors on the subject's fingers to track muscle tone, and just as the subject began to drift off, the device played a timed audio cue. Remember to think of a tree.
And they dreamt of trees.
Oh, they didn't just dream of trees. The reports are incredible. They show that the brain took that simple prompt and just exploded it. One subject saw trees splitting into infinite pieces. Another felt they were much bigger than trees and eating them like finger food. Another was transported by roots to different locations.
It sounds like a mild psychedelic trip.
The subjects themselves reported a sense of untethered consciousness. They said it helped them break out of banal stories. And crucially, upon waking, these people performed significantly better on creative problem-solving tasks than the control group. We proved that we can insert a seed tree, and the sleeping brain will grow a forest of ideas that the waking mind could never invent. That is harnessing the interface.
Okay, I admit the efficacy. The Dormio device works. We can insert themes. My concern is not can we, but should we? You call this harnessing the interface. I call it breaching the perimeter.
Why shouldn't we? If we can boost creativity and solve problems while we sleep, that's just pure efficiency. It unlocks the other third of our lives.
Because sleep is the last refuge of the disconnected mind. You call it the infinite library, I call it the safe offline environment. We are already seeing the damage of intrusion in our waking lives. I mean, look at the research on screen time and blue light. We know that our modern exposure to devices disrupts melatonin, delays circadian rhythms, fragments sleep. And now you want to bring the devices into the dream?
But that's accidental disruption. TDI, this intentional enhancement. It's controlled.
It's all input. We have the TV effect. We know people who watched black and white TV in the 50s started dreaming in grayscale. We are permeable. We soak up our environment. If we start intentionally turning our sleep into a workspace, using it to write code or solve problems, we are overriding the biological necessity of the eraser.
So you're worried we'll burn out the janitor?
I'm worried we'll turn the only time our brain has to detox and recover into just another 8-hour shift of productivity. The 90% eraser exists for a reason. We aren't supposed to remember every tree we eat like finger food. We're supposed to wake up with a clean slate. The brain needs that disconnection to perform the replay and the cleaning you described. If you keep the input port open, the maintenance cycle never finishes.
I see that risk. It's a valid point. But I think the potential outweighs it. The fact here, the core reality, is that the barrier between the conscious and unconscious is permeable. It is not a solid wall. Whether it was our ancestors practicing first sleep and second sleep, using that waking gap for contemplation,
which was a natural rhythm, I might add,
or us using the Dormio device today, the point is we can build a bridge. The sleeping brain is an intelligent system. It simulates threats, it consolidates memory, it creates these hyper-associative connections that waking logic cannot touch. To say we should just leave it alone is to ignore the most powerful computer we own.
And to say we should interface with it is to treat a biological organism like a computer. The brain has its own operating system. It has the glymphatic cleaning cycle. It has the emotional regulation of REM. When you try to run waking world applications on that OS, you risk crashing the whole thing.
But look at the convergence of the data. The fMRI shows us the structure. The incubation shows us the responsiveness. The threat simulation shows us the utility. We are standing at the threshold of understanding the nighttime self not as a passive victim of biology, but as an active participant.
I will concede that the nighttime self is active. The sleep tree reports of untethered consciousness are fascinating. It proves that a distinct, highly complex form of consciousness persists. But I insist that its logic is not our logic. The hyper-associativity, the chaos, is the point. And when we use AI to smooth it into a story, or incubation to force it into a topic, we're domesticating a wild animal. We might make it useful, but we might also kill the very thing that makes it vital.
But isn't that the history of human progress? Domesticating the wild to improve our lives?
Not when the wild is the very mechanism that keeps you sane.
I think we have found the core of our disagreement. I see a frontier to be explored, you see a sanctuary to be protected. But we can both agree on the magnitude of the discovery.
Absolutely. The mechanisms are awe-inspiring. From the shrinking neurons of the detox to the flight simulator of nightmares, the machinery is breathtaking. But we have to remember that much of this machinery relies on disconnection from the waking world to function properly. The video generated by fMRI is a map, not the territory. We can look at the map, but let's not mistake it for the experience itself.
And I would summarize by saying that the era of sleep as death is over. We have tools, fMRI, AI, targeted dream incubation, that prove the sleeping mind is a creator of worlds, a healer of memories, and a solvable mystery. We have found the library, and we have just learned how to read the books.
Just be careful which books you decide to write in.
That was fact number 1, the absolute pinnacle of our countdown. We hope this journey through the sleeping mind has changed how you see the world today.
And to you, the listener, thank you for spending this time with us. If you're still listening, you are part of the small group of superfans who truly value deep dive knowledge, and we are honored to have you in our community.
If you enjoyed this 2-hour session, please subscribe to join our daily journey, share this episode with someone who loves a mystery, and tell us in the comments which fact blew your mind the most. We read every single one.
We'll be back tomorrow with another countdown of the most magnificent facts in existence. Until then, stay curious, and thanks for listening to the Extraordinary 10 podcast.